The solar system does not end where the drawings stop. It only becomes harder to prove. Past Neptune, past the orbit of Pluto, past the cold province of icy bodies we call the Kuiper Belt, the sun still holds matter in long, slow obedience. But its light is thin there, its warmth has almost no authority. A world can move through that darkness for centuries and return almost nothing to the telescopes waiting on Earth. That is why the edge looked convincing. Not because it was necessarily real, because it was quiet. For decades, the outer solar system carried a shape that felt simple enough to trust. Neptune marked the last giant planet. Pluto, once treated as the final world, became one member of a broader frozen population. The Kuiper Belt spread beyond it like a distant shelf of leftovers from planet formation. Then, somewhere around 50 astronomical units from the Sun, the known population seemed to thin. The dots became fewer. The diagrams opened into blank space. And blank space has a talent for sounding final. But an empty-looking region is not always empty. Sometimes it has been cleared. Sometimes nothing formed there. Sometimes objects are present but too faint, too dark, too slow, or too far from the right part of their orbits to be caught by the surveys looking for them. The eye sees absence. The instrument records fewer detections. The mind quietly does the most dangerous thing it can do with incomplete evidence. It turns difficulty into geography. Then Subaru looked deeper. Working with the New Horizons mission, astronomers using the Subaru Telescope found candidate objects far beyond the traditional reach of the Kuiper Belt. Not a single blazing world, not a new Jupiter hiding in the dark, not a science fiction object with a clean name and a dramatic silhouette. Something much less convenient, and therefore more interesting. Faint icy bodies, some reported at distances around 70 to 90 astronomical units from the Sun, where the old picture had begun to relax. That kind of discovery does not break the solar system open with spectacle. It loosens one of its seams. An astronomical unit is the distance from Earth to the Sun. 1 unit is the scale inside which our idea of sunlight was born. At 1 astronomical unit, light becomes weather. It warms skin, drives oceans, feeds leaves, pulls seasons through fields, and gives morning its ordinary mercy. 30 astronomical units carries you to Neptune, where sunlight is already a weakened thing. 50 carries you toward the old outer shoulder of the Kuiper Belt. 70 is different. 80 is not just farther. It is a change in the meaning of the sun. Stand, in thought, on one of those distant bodies. The ground beneath you is not soil. It is ancient ice, darkened by radiation, dust, and time. There is no air to soften the horizon, no blue sky to hold the light, no wind to move across your suit, no sound except the faint mechanical contact of your own body trying to stay alive. The sun is still the brightest object in the sky, but it no longer feels like the sun of Earth. It is a hard, white point. A furnace reduced to an instruction. Your gloved thumb could hide it. That is what 70 or 80 astronomical units means when the number is forced back into the body. The sun still owns the orbit, but it no longer owns the skin. Warmth has become something that must be manufactured. Light has become a signal rather than an embrace. A year may stretch across many human lifetimes. A single circuit around the sun could begin before a kingdom rises and end after its language has become a museum object. In that kind of distance, even a small body becomes severe evidence. Its position asks how it got there. If those objects formed where they are, then the young solar system's disk may have extended farther or carried more material than some models allowed. If they formed closer in, then something moved them outward. Neptune's migration may have scattered, trapped, or stranded icy bodies in separated regions. Passing stars in the sun's birth environment may have tugged at the outskirts before the solar system became the lonely architecture we see now. Or the apparent structure may be partly an observational wound, a shape produced by what our surveys could and could not find. None of those possibilities is decorative. Each one rewrites the past. The solar system was not assembled as a neat sequence of finished planets. It was sorted out of a disk by collision, growth, migration, resonance, loss, and survival. Giant planets did not simply sit down in their modern places like furniture. Small bodies were scattered, captured, shattered, preserved, or expelled. The arrangement we call stable is not the opposite of violence. It is what remained after the unstable pieces were removed. Every orbit is a survivor's statement. That is why a faint object beyond the known belt matters more than its size. It does not need to be grand, it only needs to be real. If one distant body exists where the map expected decline, more may exist below the detection limit. If more exist, the old boundary may not be a boundary at all. It may be a gap, a valley, a bias, a scar, or the near edge of a colder structure we have only begun to notice. The phrase "behind the Kuiper Belt" sounds theatrical. The reality is stranger because it is quieter. Nothing is hiding with intention. The objects are hidden by distance, darkness, slow motion, poor reflection, orbital geometry, and the ordinary limits of human instruments. They are hidden because a telescope must gather sunlight that has travelled outward for billions of kilometres, struck a small frozen body, and returned almost emptied of force. They are hidden because the sky behind them is crowded with stars. They are hidden because a body that moves too slowly can look almost fixed until time itself becomes part of the instrument. Discovery out there begins as comparison. One image, then another. A faint point shifts. Not enough to impress the eye. Enough to disturb the background. That disturbance is the beginning of knowledge. A dot that moves may belong to the solar system. A dot that returns in the right place may earn an orbit. An orbit may reveal a population. A population may expose a false edge. The process is slow, and that slowness protects the story from cheap wonder. No honest version of this discovery should pretend the solar system has suddenly been solved in reverse. It has not. The new candidates need more observation. Their orbits must be refined. Their population must be tested against survey bias. The possible extension of the Kuiper Belt must survive better data, wider searches, and colder statistical judgment. But uncertainty does not make the finding small, it makes it alive. A finished answer would be easier. A damaged assumption is more valuable. New Horizons gives this uncertainty a physical witness. The spacecraft has already passed Pluto and Arakoth, already turned distant points into landscapes. Now it continues outward, aging into a quieter role. It measures dust, it listens to the environment. It crosses the same vast region that telescopes from Earth are trying to map by faint reflected light. Somewhere far from every city, a small machine moves through the leftovers of planet formation and sends back numbers across the dark. A weak signal arrives. A receiver locks. The outer solar system for a moment becomes audible as data. That is the real force of the title. Not that astronomers found a monster behind the Kuiper Belt. Not that a hidden planet has been confirmed. Not that the edge of the solar system has been replaced by one cleaner line farther out. The discovery is more unsettling than that, because it attacks the habit beneath all those simpler stories. It says the map became confident too early. The old edge was not necessarily where the solar system stopped placing matter. It may have been where our evidence stopped being strong enough to speak clearly. And that difference changes the emotional shape of home. Earth is not sitting inside a completed diagram. It is orbiting in the bright inner part of a system whose cold margins are still being counted. Neptune is not the final blue marker before simplicity. Pluto is not the end, nor even the full correction to the end. The Kuiper Belt itself may be only the first visible layer of a larger frozen record. Out beyond it, small bodies continue their long curves. They do not announce themselves. They do not know they are evidence. They simply remain, almost lightless, almost motionless to human patience, carrying the history of forces older than any surface on Earth can remember. The edge was never a wall. It was the place where our light ran out first. A border made from weak evidence can look almost identical to a border made from matter. That is the danger in the old drawing. The familiar map shows Neptune, then Pluto's tilted path, then the Kuiper Belt spread beyond them as a pale swarm of frozen remnants. Farther out, the swarm thins, the dots become sparse. The page opens into clean darkness. To the eye, that openness feels like information. It appears to say, the main debris field ends here. But the sky did not say that. The sky only gave fewer answers. A telescope does not receive distance directly. It receives light. It receives position. It receives motion if the observer waits long enough. From those clues, astronomers rebuild the hidden geometry. A small body beyond Neptune does not arrive as a world. It arrives as a nearly exhausted point against a background crowded with stars and galaxies. It has no visible horizon, no landscape, no scale the eye can trust. It is almost nothing until it moves. And even movement becomes difficult there. Near Earth, motion announces itself quickly. A nearby asteroid can shift against the stars in a way that feels alive on human timescales. Far beyond Neptune, an object may creep so slowly that a single image tells almost nothing. The body must be photographed, then photographed again. Its position must change by the right amount. The change must be separated from noise, from detector artifacts, from background sources, from the imperfect atmosphere above the telescope. Only then does the dot begin to detach from the rest of the universe and become part of home. That is a strange threshold. A world enters the solar system by failing to stay still. The farther out it is, the more severe the test becomes. Sunlight has to leave the sun, cross billions of kilometers, strike a dark, icy surface, scatter back across the same enormous distance, pass through Earth's restless air, and land inside a detector with enough strength to be recognized. The journey punishes the signal twice. Distance dims the light on the way out. Distance dims it again on the way home. So a small body does not merely become faint. It becomes nearly deniable. This is why the Kuiper Belt has always been partly a region and partly a confession. The region is real. Icy bodies beyond Neptune, shaped by gravity, collision and time. But the edges of what we know are not the edges of what exists. They are the edges of successful detection. When the catalogue thins, it may be tracing a physical decline. It may also be tracing the moment our instruments begin losing the argument. The old map could not easily separate those two facts. A forest does not end where a lantern fails. But if you carry only one lantern, the mistake can feel natural. Pluto once stood inside that mistake with almost ceremonial authority. For much of the 20th century, it was the final planet, the last bead in the schoolroom sequence, the cold punctuation mark after Neptune. Its smallness was not emotionally obvious. Its loneliness was the point. It seemed to hold the outer darkness in place, as if the solar system had placed one final object at the threshold and then fallen silent. Then the silence filled with neighbours. More trans-Neptunian objects were found. Some moved in resonant patterns with Neptune. Some followed stretched or tilted paths. Some were large enough to make Pluto look less like an exception and more like a member of a family. The story did not simply demote Pluto. It demoted the idea of a simple ending. Pluto did not become less interesting. It became less alone. That change matters because it shows how a boundary can migrate inside the human mind. First, Pluto was the edge. Then the Kuiper Belt became the edge. The correction hardened into a new picture. The swarm beyond Neptune replaced the lonely planet, and the old confidence quietly rebuilt itself farther out. This is how knowledge can improve and still become too comfortable. A better map is still a map. It still wants lines. The classical Kuiper Belt, often described as extending from around 30 to roughly 50 astronomical units, gave astronomers a structure to work with. Inside that region, known objects form populations with different dynamical histories. Some are relatively stable, some are resonant, some are scattered. The belt was never simple in detail. but it still gave the outer solar system a recognizable form. Then came the apparent decline. Past the old outer shoulder, detections dropped. That drop could have been telling the truth. Perhaps the primordial disk ended there. Perhaps Neptune's migration cleared or shaped the region. Perhaps the Sun's early environment cut the disk short. A real outer edge would be scientifically rich. It would not be a boring emptiness. It would be a clue left by formation. A sharp boundary is never only a boundary. It is a cause waiting to be identified. But an apparent edge can be made by observation itself. The bodies farther out are fainter, their motion is slower, their orbits may carry them into parts of the sky where surveys are less complete. Their surfaces may be darker than expected. Their brightness may fall below the threshold where they can be detected reliably. The decline may contain real structure and still be distorted by the way we search. That is the uncomfortable part. Reality and bias can occupy the same darkness. The sky does not label one from the other. In an observatory, that problem becomes physical. The dome turns under cold air. A motor gives a low, controlled hum. The telescope gathers a field that appears still. On the screen, thousands of points hold their positions with the apparent patience of eternity. Somewhere among them, perhaps, one point belongs not to the deep background, but to the sun's own debris. It is closer than almost everything around it, yet dimmer than almost everything the eye wants to notice. The nearby thing hides among the distant things. Only time can separate it. That is why the search is not a single act of looking. It is a measured act of returning. Images must be compared. Candidate motions must be tested. Follow-up must keep the object from being lost. A faint body without a recovered path can fall back into uncertainty. Discovery in the outer solar system is not a shout. It is a chain of recognitions, each one fragile until the next holds. A dot. A shift. A second night. A rough arc. A possible orbit. A place in the architecture of the sun. The architecture is what matters now. If objects exist beyond the old Kuiper Belt decline in meaningful numbers, then the outer solar system cannot be treated as a simple fading shelf. It may contain a separated population. It may contain a broader extension. It may contain a gap whose meaning has not been properly read. It may force the old word belt to stretch until it breaks. That would not make earlier astronomy foolish. It would make the new evidence useful. Science advances by discovering where its own simplifications have begun to expire. The old map did work. It organised real detections. It captured a real population beyond Neptune. It corrected Pluto's false loneliness. But no map deserves loyalty after the territory starts resisting it. And the territory is resisting. Not loudly. Not with a planet filling a camera frame. With faint bodies appearing where the diagram had grown pale. That is enough. Because in the outer solar system, small evidence can carry large consequence. A single distant object may be a statistical whisper. Several may become a structural hint. A confirmed population would become an argument about formation, migration, clearing, preservation, and the limits of observation. The importance does not come from drama. It comes from placement. The object is a sentence, written far from the fire. Its orbit is the grammar. Its faintness is the reason we almost failed to read it. The old blank region now feels less passive. It no longer behaves like a clean absence after the known belt. It feels provisional, charged, waiting to be tested by deeper surveys and longer baselines. What once looked like the edge of debris may become a valley between structures. What seemed like thinning may become undercounting. What appeared to be the solar system relaxing into emptiness may turn out to be the page on which our instruments stopped writing clearly. That is the real turn. The question is no longer simply, what lies beyond the Kuiper Belt? The sharper question is, how much of the solar system has been shaped by what we were able to notice first? The answer will not arrive all at once. It will come through slower catalogues, better orbits, corrected biases, and the patience to let faint points accumulate into structure. The darkness will not become transparent, it will become less mute. And in that change, the old edge loses its authority. Neptune remains, Pluto remains, the known Kuiper Belt remains. Nothing familiar has been erased, but the space beyond them has changed category. It is no longer only after. It is no longer only blank. It is a region where the map must speak more carefully, because silence there has already fooled us once. A boundary made of weak light can look final, until one cold point moves. The telescope did not find the outer dark by staring harder. It found it by refusing to believe the first silence. On Mauna Kea, the Subaru Telescope waits above much of Earth's weather, inside air thin enough to make every machine seem more awake than the people around it. The dome turns with a low, restrained hum. Metal settles in the cold. Far below, cities spend light recklessly. Above, the sky is crowded with stars that have nothing to do with the solar system at all. The task is to find the few points that do. That sounds simple until the scale enters the light. A body beyond Neptune does not shine, it borrows. Sunlight leaves the sun, weakens across billions of kilometers, touches an ice-dark surface, then returns almost emptied by the same distance. By the time it reaches Earth, the signal is no longer generous enough to look like a world. It is a pixel with a burden. Even existence is not enough. The object must be bright enough to record, slow enough to belong to the outer solar system, but not so slow that the search fails to separate it from the fixed background. It must lie inside the field Subaru happens to image. It must return in later observations. It must survive the pipeline, the weather, the moon, the galaxy behind it, and the human suspicion that most faint things are not discoveries. The universe is allowed to be inconvenient. That is why Subaru's strength matters. It is not only a large mirror gathering weak light, it is the combination of depth and width. A narrow telescope can look deeply into one piece of darkness and miss the body just outside the frame. A shallow survey can cover the sky and fail to catch what distance is nearly erased. The outer solar system requires both patience and area. It punishes the instrument that brings only one virtue. A faint object at 80 astronomical units is not waiting in the dark like a posed subject. It is crossing an enormous orbit with almost no urgency. The camera records a field, then another. The star pattern holds. One point, perhaps, shifts by less than the eye wants to respect. That shift has to be measured, doubted, recovered, linked. Only after that chain tightens does the object become more than a blemish in the data. Discovery begins as an accusation against stillness. New Horizons changes the meaning of that accusation because it is not on Earth anymore. Subaru looks outward from a mountain. New Horizons moves outward through the region being questioned. After Pluto, after Arakoth, after the famous images had already rewritten two distant objects into terrain, the spacecraft became something quieter and more useful, a witness left inside the problem. That is a different kind of exploration. A flyby gives the public a face, mountains, plains, a horizon, a surface with shadows. But after the encounter, when the dramatic target falls behind, the mission enters a colder role. It measures dust. It studies the background environment. It keeps moving through a volume that most maps reduce to a label. The spacecraft is no longer only visiting objects. It is crossing the space between them, where a hidden population may reveal itself not as a photograph, but as residue. Dust matters because dust is evidence of bodies doing work. Collisions grind material down. Impacts throw grains outward. Small icy objects shed, fracture, erode, and feed the medium around them. If the Kuiper Belt truly faded sharply near the old boundary, the dust environment should begin to reflect that decline. If more bodies exist farther out, if the belt extends or reappears beyond a gap, then dust can become an indirect witness before the bodies themselves are counted well. A grain hitting a detector is not spectacular. It is a small knock from an unseen architecture. Picture the spacecraft moving through that architecture. No engine plume brightens behind it. No wake follows through the vacuum. Its body is wrapped in insulation, its instruments aging, its power finite. It travels faster than any ordinary human vehicle, yet against the scale beyond Neptune, it seems almost still. Every command from Earth arrives late. Every reply returns as a weakened signal, a mathematical whisper stretched across distance. A receiver waits. A soft lock. A number comes home from a place no hand will touch. That number does not solve the map, it argues with it. This is the reason the Subaru and New Horizons connection matters so much. One instrument searches for the possible bodies, the other samples the environment those bodies may help create. Subaru asks, where are the faint points? New Horizons asks, what is the space between them like? Neither question is enough alone. Together they make the old emptiness answer from two directions. The answer is still cautious. It has to be. Distant candidates need longer arcs before their orbits are secure. Dust measurements need interpretation, because dust can have more than one source. A population suggested by a handful of objects must be tested against bias, sensitivity, sky coverage, and the cruel fact that the easiest objects to find are not always representative of what exists. The stronger the story sounds, the more discipline it requires. That discipline is what keeps the discovery valuable. A cheap version would rush towards certainty. It would say the Kuiper Belt is twice as large, or that a second belt has been confirmed, or that astronomers have found the hidden edge of the solar system. The better version is less obedient to excitement. It says the old boundary has become suspicious. It says there may be more distant structure than expected. It says the darkness beyond the known belt is no longer allowed to be treated as simple. A damaged assumption can be more important than a dramatic object. The old assumption was not foolish. It came from real detections, real limits, real modelling, real attempts to understand a region that barely returns light. But assumptions age. They harden invisibly. A line first drawn as provisional begins to feel like geography. The instrument improves, the spacecraft keeps going, and the line starts to fail in public. That failure is a form of progress. The telescope on the mountain and the spacecraft in the cold are doing the same moral work in different languages. They are separating absence from invisibility. They are asking whether the solar system truly thins where we thought it did, or whether the first edge was partly made from our inability to count faint things at the far side of warmth. This is where the outer solar system becomes intimate in the wrong way. Not because it is close, because it belongs to us and still resists us. A galaxy can remain unknown without wounding the idea of home. The beginning of time can stay mysterious without embarrassing a schoolroom map. But the region beyond Neptune is not elsewhere in that clean sense. It is the same system, the same sun, the same formation story, the same debris field whose inner consequences eventually made rock, ocean, air, and bodies able to wonder about debris. So when a dot moves beyond the old expectation, the correction comes inward. It says the warm centre has misunderstood its own outskirts. The image returns to the dome. Cold air, quiet motors, a mirror holding still against the rotation of Earth, a field of stars repeating on a screen. Somewhere in that field, a nearly erased point shifts by the right amount. Far beyond the atmosphere, New Horizons continues through the leftovers, listening for the tiny impacts of material too small to become a world and too meaningful to ignore. No single observation opens the dark. The opening comes from pressure. A faint point. A dust count. A recovered orbit. A model forced to loosen. A boundary that can no longer defend itself as cleanly as before. That is how the solar system changes shape at its edge. Not with a door, not with a revelation bright enough for the eye. With machines, patient enough to notice that silence, when measured carefully, had texture all along. The old map was not wounded by size. It was wounded by placement. A large planet would have been easier to understand emotionally. It would dominate the story at once. It would pull every camera, every headline, every theory toward its own mass. But the reported distant objects beyond the familiar Kuiper Belt are not powerful in that way. Their force comes from being modest and inconvenient, small enough to ignore at first, far enough to make ignoring them dangerous. A dot in the expected place confirms a map. A dot in the wrong place interrogates it. Some of the most interesting candidates appear at distances around 70 to 90 astronomical units from the Sun. That range matters because the known Kuiper Belt had seemed to decline much closer in, around the old outer shoulder near 50 astronomical units. The difference is not just arithmetic, it changes the shape of the question. A gradual fading belt tells one story. A decline followed by more bodies farther out tells another. An edge says the material ran out. A gap says the system did something. That is why the possible separation matters. If there is a relatively emptier region beyond the classical belt, and then another distant population, the outer solar system stops looking like debris thinning naturally into darkness. It begins to look structured, not cleanly structured, not proven in full, but structured enough that absence itself becomes suspicious. In planetary systems, missing matter is rarely neutral. A gap can be a scar. A gap can be a rhythm. A gap can be where gravity kept removing what tried to remain. Saturn's rings make that lesson visible in miniature. Their dark divisions are not simple emptiness. They are shaped by resonance, by timing, by gravitational influence repeated until material cannot stay evenly spread. What looks like a break is the visible result of law. The Kuiper Belt is not a ring system shining in a telescope, and its distances are almost absurd by comparison. But the principle is colder and larger there. If a gap has shape, then the gap has history. A missing region can be a fossil too. The objects beyond it would then become more than isolated survivors. They would be witnesses on the far side of an event. Perhaps they formed there, in a broader primordial disk, whose full size we underestimated. Perhaps they were scattered outward by Neptune during its migration. Perhaps they were influenced by the Sun's birth environment when neighbouring stars passed close enough to disturb the outer debris. Perhaps the pattern is partly real and partly made by observation, with survey limits carving false valleys into the known population. The answer may not be singular. The danger is wanting it to be. A single explanation would calm the map too quickly. It would let the mind replace one old line with one new line, one false certainty with a fresher-looking version of the same habit. But the outer solar system was not assembled by a single clean stroke. It was accumulated, disturbed, thinned, trapped, scattered, and preserved. Its present shape is not a design, it is a remainder. Remainders are not simple. They are what survived competing causes. To feel what this means, imagine the young outer solar system before it became quiet enough for charts. Not a row of planets, not a belt, not empty black with named bodies placed at intervals. A disk of gas, dust, ice, and growing planetesimals surrounded the young sun. Larger bodies fed on smaller ones. Gravity amplified small differences. A forming giant planet changed the futures of objects it never touched. A close pass could stretch an orbit. A resonance could hold a body in rhythm. A collision could erase one history and create several smaller ones. There was no sound. But there was sorting. A long, granular rearrangement in the dark. The modern solar system is what remained after that sorting stopped being obvious. The stable paths survived, the unstable paths emptied. Some bodies were swallowed by planets, some were thrown inward, some were cast outward, some escaped the sun completely and became wanderers between stars. Others stayed, not because they were chosen, but because their particular combination of position, speed, and timing did not destroy them. Survival is a filter. The distant candidates beyond the old Kuiper Belt may be products of that filter. If they belong to a real population, their existence would constrain the violence that made them possible. Too little disturbance, and they may not get there. Too much, and they do not remain. Too narrow an early disk, and they cannot form in place. Too weak a survey, and they exist without being counted. Every explanation has a price. The outer solar system does not allow free mysteries. If the bodies formed where they are, the young disk must pay in mass, density, and time. At 70 or 80 astronomical units, growth is difficult. Material is spread thin, orbits are long, encounters are less frequent. Building even small worlds there before the gas and dust dispersed becomes a demand on the early conditions. The faint object says, the nursery may have been wider than you thought. If the bodies were moved there, gravity must pay. Neptune becomes central again. A migrating giant can scatter small icy bodies outward, but scattering is not careful. Some objects are placed into survivable orbits, others are lost. A mechanism strong enough to populate the distance must also explain why the survivors were not simply ejected into interstellar space. It must account for the gap, the distribution, the inclinations, the eccentricities, the bodies that remained close, and the bodies that did not. If a passing star helped shape the region, the sun's childhood must pay. The solar system would then carry a memory of company, not the solitude we see now, but a crowded birth environment where another star's gravity reached into the young outskirts and altered what could stay attached. The star is gone. Its name is unrecoverable. Its path through the nursery is not printed in the sky. But the debris may still hold the consequence. A small, icy body can remember a vanished neighbour. Not with thought, with an orbit. This is why counting matters. 11 distant candidates, or any small early sample, should not be treated as a completed census. But they should also not be dismissed as mere dots. Survey astronomy begins with partial exposures of larger populations. What becomes visible first is never the whole field. The objects that cross the detection threshold are the survivors of the search itself, bright enough, placed well enough, moving properly enough, observed often enough. The visible count is not the population. It is the population filtered through the instrument. That filter can mislead in both directions. It can make a real population look sparse. It can make a sparse population look patterned. It can exaggerate a gap or blur one away. It can privilege bodies at certain orbital positions and neglect others. This is why the new objects must be folded into models carefully, with the search biases kept close instead of hidden behind excitement. But care is not dismissal. Care is how the mystery keeps its bones. The old boundary near 50 astronomical units once gave the solar system a feeling of completion. Beyond it, the known belt seemed to drop away. The mind did what minds do. It made the decline into a shelf edge. Yet if bodies are confirmed far beyond that zone, the shelf becomes harder to defend. The outer region may not be a clean fall into nothing. It may be an archipelago, one visible band, a colder interval, then another set of islands farther from the fire. An archipelago is harder to draw than a belt. It is also harder to explain. Each island asks why it rose there and not elsewhere. Each channel asks what kept it open. The distances between bodies become part of the story, not empty space between facts. The map gains negative pressure. It becomes important not only where the objects are, but where they seem not to be. That is a more mature kind of wonder. Not amazement that the universe is large. Amazement that the absences have structure. Picture one of those far objects moving through its immense year. There is no weather, no sea, no atmosphere blue enough to dignify the horizon. The sun is a bright point behind the long arithmetic of distance. The surface, if we could stand there, might be dark and uneven, armoured with ancient ice and radiation-processed material. A boot scrape would send no sound into the open. Only the suit would carry the vibration back to bone. The silence would not feel empty. It would feel stored. Stored in the crust, stored in the orbit, stored in the cold that slowed change until a small body could outlast the surfaces of worlds much larger than itself. Somewhere in that path is a record of formation or displacement. Somewhere in that darkness is the answer to why it remained, while countless other bodies did not. That is the strange dignity of debris. A planet can hide its childhood beneath beauty. Atmospheres, oceans, weather, tectonics, heat, and life can turn the earliest record into something broken and overwritten. A minor icy body has fewer ways to dazzle us, but also fewer ways to erase itself. It is not important because it became grand. It is important because it did not become something else. It stayed small enough to remember. The old map could not hold that dignity. It ranked the solar system by visual authority. The sun, the planets, the famous moons, the rings, the named dwarf worlds. The farther debris became background. But the background is where the formation story may be least damaged. The faintest objects may carry some of the oldest constraints. A cold point can be a better historian than a beautiful planet. That is what the distant candidates are beginning to suggest. The place behind the Kuiper Belt may not be a dramatic secret chamber. It may be a second page of the same ancient record, separated from the first by a gap we do not yet understand. If so, the discovery is not only about extending a belt, it is about discovering that the belt was never the whole sentence. The chart once faded outward with confidence. Now the fading has texture. A telescope notices a displacement, a model strains, a boundary loses innocence. The objects themselves remain small, silent, and almost unbearably remote, but their placement gives them authority. They stand, if that word can be used for bodies in orbit, on the far side of an old assumption. And from there they do the most powerful thing a faint object can do. They make the blank space answer back. Distance begins as a measurement. Then it becomes a condition. The phrase 80 astronomical units can pass through the mind too cleanly. It sounds like a number placed after other numbers. Earth at 1, Neptune near 30, the old Kuiper Belt shoulder near 50, new candidates farther out, somewhere around 70, 80, 90. The sequence looks orderly, almost harmless, until the body tries to inhabit it. The body fails. Human scale was not built for this kind of far. It understands a room, a hill, a shoreline, the time between one breath and the next. It can stretch toward a mountain range, a continent, a moon. But the outer solar system breaks the old instruments of feeling. Past Neptune, distance no longer means simply more space between objects. It changes what light is allowed to do. At Earth, sunlight is not an object of thought. It is the condition beneath thought. It enters the atmosphere and becomes weather. It strikes oceans and lifts vapour into clouds. It warms soil, pulls green matter from seed, reddens skin, casts the shadows by which a child learns morning from afternoon. Every ordinary day is built on a violence of energy, arriving so steadily that it feels gentle. Nothing about that generosity survives intact at 80 astronomical units. The sun is still there. It still dominates the orbit. Its gravity still gives the body a path and keeps the path from becoming exile. But the warmth has been thinned almost beyond emotional recognition. Light falls with the square of distance. Push something 80 times farther from the sun than Earth, and the sunlight becomes thousands of times weaker. The number is simple. The consequence is not. Noon loses its meaning. A surface can still be lit. A shadow can still fall. A camera can still record brightness if it waits and gathers enough. But to a human body, that light would not feel like day. It would feel like a memory of day, stripped of mercy. The sun would be a brilliant point in a black sky, too bright to ignore, too small to comfort. That is the first real translation of distance. The sun remains central while ceasing to feel near. Imagine standing there, sealed inside machinery that must make every second survivable. The ground is not ground in the earthly sense. It is ancient ice, mixed with darker material, hardened and altered by radiation, dusted by micrometeorites, perhaps fractured by impacts older than any human language. There is no air to blue the horizon, no pressure on the face, no wind moving loose grains across the surface. If a boot scrapes the crust, the sound does not travel outward. It returns only through contact, through the suit, through bone. The universe is not quiet there. Quiet is a word invented by creatures with air. There is something harsher than quiet, no medium for sound to become public. The surface receives the scrape and keeps it local. The stars do not shimmer. The sun does not spread into a sky. The planets are gone from ordinary sight. Earth is not a blue world. It is an inner coordinate buried close to solar glare, a warm accident hidden in the brightness of the star that made it possible. From that distance, home would not look central. It would look concealed. That reversal matters. The inner solar system teaches us to confuse importance with visibility. Earth feels obvious because we are inside its atmosphere. The sun feels generous because we are close enough for its violence to become climate rather than abstraction. The outer bodies correct that instinct without raising a voice. They show that a thing can belong to the same system and still live under conditions almost completely foreign to the system's warm interior. Belonging is not comfort. An icy object at 80 astronomical units still belongs to the sun, but it belongs the way a distant memory belongs to a life, held by structure, not warmth. Its orbit may take many hundreds of Earth years. A single circuit could begin before an empire stabilizes and end after its monuments have become stone puzzles. Its seasons, if its tilt and orbit give it anything like seasons, would not be seasons the body could understand. They would be slow changes in an already thin poverty of light. A year out there is not a calendar. It is geology learning to count. This is why the newly reported distant candidates are not just farther entries in a catalogue. Their distance changes the physical regime of the question. A population at 70 to 90 astronomical units would occupy a colder, slower, dimmer domain than the classical belt. Formation becomes harder. Detection becomes crueler. Preservation becomes more powerful. The same object that frustrates the telescope may preserve information the inner system has spent billions of years destroying. Earth is rich because it forgets. That sentence is not poetic decoration, it is geology. The planet's habitability depends on motion and exchange. Rock melts, crust subducts, volcanoes vent, rain erodes, rivers transport, oceans dissolve. Life enters chemical cycles and turns atmosphere into biography. The same processes that make Earth a living world shred its oldest evidence. Warmth gives complexity, and complexity edits the archive. A frozen body far beyond Neptune has fewer gifts, so it may keep different truths. It has not been kneaded by plate tectonics. It has not weathered under rain. It has not breathed through oceans. It has not allowed biology to rewrite its surface with appetite. Its record is not untouched. No exposed object in space is untouched. Radiation darkens it. Impacts bruise it. Volatiles may migrate. Collisions may expose buried layers. But change there is starved, stretched, rationed by cold. Time does not flow through such a body the way it flows through Earth. It accumulates. A crater can remain as a long memory. A surface colour can carry radiation history. A composition can hint at the disk from which the planets formed. An orbit can preserve an encounter with Neptune, a resonance, a scattering event, a birth environment, a vanished stellar neighbour, or a pathway no longer visible except through the bodies that survived it. The object does not need grandeur. It needs endurance. That is a different hierarchy from the one the eye prefers. The eye wants Jupiter, Saturn, rings, storms, clouds, worlds large enough to impress a camera. But the history of the solar system is not stored only in its monuments. Sometimes the grand worlds are poor witnesses precisely because they are grand. They are active, heated, layered, altered, self-erasing. Their beauty is a form of concealment. A dark fragment can be less beautiful and more honest. That is the pressure behind the distance. At 70 or 80 astronomical units, the object is not merely hard to reach, it is hard to interpret without humility. Its faintness is not an inconvenience attached to the science. Its faintness is part of the science. What we find first will be biased toward brightness, size, reflectivity, orbital position, and survey design. What remains unseen may outnumber what enters the catalogue. The darkness is not a container waiting to be emptied by better instruments. It is an active filter, shaping the evidence before the evidence reaches us. The farther out we search, the more the map becomes a collaboration between reality and detection. This collaboration is dangerous because it can make our ignorance look natural. A real decline in objects and a decline in our ability to see them can occupy the same region. A gap can be dynamical, primordial, observational, or some mixture that resists clean naming. A distant population can look sparse because it is sparse, or because only the brightest members have crossed into view. Every new point helps, but no point arrives without the shadow of the method that found it. Distance does not only weaken light, it weakens confidence. That weakening is useful. It forces the old map to stop pretending. It asks us to treat the outer solar system not as a diagram with a final shelf, but as a field of conditions: cold, slow, faint, preserved, biased, structured, unfinished. Each added astronomical unit alters the relationship between body, sun, observer, and history. At 1 astronomical unit, the sun is life. At 30, it is still a visible ruler of a giant planet's realm. At 50, it lights the known belt with distant authority. At 80, it becomes law more than warmth. A law can hold what it no longer comforts. Out there, New Horizons becomes almost a moral object, not because machines have morals, but because its journey exposes the difference between speed and scale. By human standards, the spacecraft is moving incredibly fast. Against the outer solar system, it seems patient. It crosses distance with no dramatic wake, no engine flame visible from behind, no sense that motion has conquered emptiness. It sends back data so slowly that communication itself feels geological. A command leaves Earth. Hours pass. The spacecraft receives an intention already old. Later, a signal returns, thinned by distance, carrying a measurement from the cold. That delay is not just a technical detail. It is distance made audible. Conversation becomes impossible. Reflex becomes useless. Control turns into planning. Exploration becomes trust extended into darkness, then answered by numbers. The same transformation happens to the sun. Near Earth, the sun is immediate. At the edge, it is delayed in every human sense, weak in heat, small in sight, slow in orbital consequence. The bodies there are not outside its kingdom, but they live where the kingdom has become almost abstract. That abstraction is what the title hides beneath its drama. Something behind the Kuiper Belt is not merely behind in space. It is behind a threshold where the words we learned near Earth begin to lose their old meanings. Day is no longer day. Year is no longer year. Cold is no longer weather. Silence is no longer quiet. Distance is no longer extension. It is transformation. And if a population exists there, then the solar system's history continues into that transformed regime. The outer record may not stop where the light became too weak for our first maps. It may continue as a colder text, written in bodies so faint that the act of finding them already tells us how easily home can conceal itself. A small object moves through that text now. No atmosphere carries its passage. No surface ocean reflects a pale sun. No observer stands on its crust. It gives back almost nothing, and that almost nothing crosses the dark toward Earth. One night, a mirror catches enough. The number enters the archive. The edge moves outward, not because the solar system changed, but because distance finally surrendered one more piece of what it had been keeping. A belt is a word that makes debris sound obedient. It gives the mind a shape it can carry. A belt circles. A belt holds. A belt suggests continuity, even when the real object is broken into distances no body can feel. The phrase Kuiper Belt sounds like a cold ring beyond Neptune, a final broad band of leftovers turning around the Sun after the grand work of planet-making has finished. But the outer solar system has never been that polite. It is not a smooth ring of ice. It is a sorted ruin. Some objects move in relatively stable paths. Some are locked into resonances with Neptune, protected by timing rather than distance. Some are scattered onto stretched orbits that carry them inward and then far back into cold. Some are detached enough that Neptune's present grip cannot easily explain their behaviour. Some may belong to a farther population we are only beginning to notice. The single word belt gathers all this disorder under one calm label. That calm is useful. It is also dangerous. Because the moment a structure receives a clean name, the mind begins to imagine it as cleaner than it is. A belt can be drawn as a band. A band can be given an edge. An edge can be mistaken for a fact. Then a faint body appears beyond that edge, and suddenly the name has to confess what it was hiding. The Kuiper Belt may not be a belt. It may be the nearest visible layer of a more complicated architecture. That possibility changes the subject. If the known belt simply faded with distance, the story would be difficult but familiar. A disk of icy bodies would grow thinner until material became scarce. Farther out, the Sun's debris would become sparse, then nearly absent, then lost inside the wider gravitational reservoir of comets. The map would remain a gradient, crowded to thin, known to unknown, warm to cold. A second structure breaks that comfort. A gap followed by another population is not a fade. It is punctuation. It says something interrupted the pattern. It says the outer disk may have been sculpted, separated, or preserved in layers. It says the solar system's outskirts may hold not one declining shelf, but multiple zones of survival. If true, the old diagram did not merely miss objects, it misread the grammar of the outer system. A belt is geography. A layered structure is history. History demands causes. Gravity is the first suspect, because gravity can make order after violence so cleanly that the violence disappears. Neptune does not need to collide with small bodies to change them forever. It only needs to approach, migrate, resonate, repeat. A body can be pushed outward without being touched. Another can be held in a protective rhythm. Another can be destabilized until its path becomes too extreme to remain in the known belt. The result, billions of years later, is not a visible wound. It is a distribution. Where bodies are not. Which orbits survive? Which regions seem strangely empty? This is the language the outer solar system speaks most fluently. Not scenery. Distribution. Not monuments. Survival statistics. A small object at 80 astronomical units may look insignificant, but its existence creates a debt. The early system must explain how matter reached that distance, how it remained there, and why other regions between here and there may appear less populated. Every faint point asks for a mechanism. Every gap asks harder. There are several ways the bill could be paid. The young solar system may have had a broader disk than expected, allowing icy bodies to form farther out. That would make the distant candidates native to their cold province. But formation at those distances is not effortless. Material thins, orbits lengthen, collisions become less frequent, growth slows. A distant native population would require the early disk to be generous enough, massive enough, or long-lived enough to build bodies before the nursery dispersed. The object would become evidence against a small beginning. Or the bodies may have formed closer to the Sun and been thrown outward. That brings Neptune back into the frame, not as a quiet blue planet, but as a former migratory force. A giant world moving through a disk of icy planetesimals can scatter them, trap them, lift them into stranger paths, or remove them entirely. Scattering is powerful, but it is not surgical. Too little disturbance leaves the object close. Too much sends it away forever. A survivor beyond the belt would mean the violence had the right strength. Strong enough to move it, not strong enough to lose it. That balance is the strange cruelty of planetary architecture. The solar system we see today may depend on countless small bodies being sacrificed into new paths so that the giant planets could settle into theirs. Neptune's present orbit may carry the memory of exchanges with debris long gone. The small bodies that remain are not decoration around the planets. They are part of the transaction that made the planet's modern order possible. The planets kept the throne. The debris kept the evidence. There is another possible author, the Sun's lost birth environment. Stars usually form in company. The young Sun may once have moved among sibling stars close enough for their gravity to matter. A passing star could have tugged at the outer disk, disturbed distant bodies, helped detach some from Neptune's reach, or carved structure before the solar system became isolated. That possibility changes the mood of the darkness. A distant icy object may not only remember the Sun, it may remember a star that left. No name, no visible trace, no myth attached to it. Only a gravitational encounter written into orbits that remained after the cluster dispersed. The solar system now feels solitary because we meet it after the crowd has gone. But its farthest debris may still carry the pressure of that vanished neighbourhood. The outer map becomes less like a family portrait, more like a room after everyone has left, with furniture slightly displaced. A belt cannot hold that story. The word is too narrow. What we may be seeing instead is an archipelago of cold evidence, a near population shaped strongly by Neptune, a possible gap whose cause is still uncertain, a farther population, if confirmed, that may preserve older or different conditions. Between the islands, distances so wide that even the Sun seems to arrive as a reduced instruction. An archipelago is not harder to draw only because it has more parts. It is harder because the water matters. The spaces between bodies become active evidence. In a simple belt, absence can be treated as thinning. In a structured outer system, absence becomes suspicious. Why fewer objects here? Why more there? Why this separation? Why this orbital distribution? Why this inclination? Why this brightness range? The negative space begins to carry as much pressure as the dots themselves. That is a more demanding kind of wonder. It does not ask the listener to gasp at size. It asks the mind to respect arrangement. The early solar system was an arrangement engine. Dust became pebbles. Pebbles became planetesimals. Planetesimals became embryos. Giant planets stirred, fed, migrated, and altered everything around them. Resonances swept through populations. Collisions made families of fragments. Some material was consumed, some was expelled. Some remained only because it happened to occupy a path the system did not punish. The present is not what was built. The present is what the building process failed to erase. That makes the Kuiper Belt less like a leftover pile and more like a forensic field. The known objects are not simply crumbs beyond Neptune, they are samples of survival. Their orbits preserve what force did to them. Their surfaces preserve what cold allowed them to keep. Their distribution preserves what the early system removed. If a further population exists, the forensic field extends. The crime scene grows. But not in the crude sense of violence for effect. The violence here is dynamical. Bodies were redirected, regions were emptied, rhythms were imposed. Some objects were given long, stable futures by the same gravity that destroyed others. The solar system did not become orderly because it was gentle. It became orderly because instability was filtered out. Order is the graveyard of failed motions. That line only matters if it stays physical. A failed motion is an orbit that cannot survive. It intersects the wrong region, It meets the wrong planet. It enters the wrong resonance. It loses energy, gains too much, collides, or escapes. What remains after billions of years are the paths that did not fail. So when we find bodies beyond the expected belt, we are not merely finding things. We are finding permitted histories. Picture the outer system from far above, not as a textbook diagram, but as a vast, dark plain scarred by invisible rules. Neptune circles near the inner border of the known debris. Beyond it, bodies occupy some paths and avoid others. Farther out, perhaps, another sparse band turns slowly around the sun. Nothing about it looks violent now. The motion is graceful enough to deceive. But grace is not innocence. A smooth orbit can be the cooled result of a brutal sorting process. This is why the possible extension beyond the Kuiper Belt should not be reduced too quickly into a single explanation. A broader disk, Neptune's migration, stellar encounters, survey bias, collisions, and perhaps other influences may all have touched the outcome. The real outer solar system may be a superposition of histories, not a clean answer waiting behind one door. That is less satisfying. It is also more likely to be true. Reality often keeps the causes separate only in our explanations. In nature, they overlap. A body may have formed in one region, been moved by Neptune, altered by collision, darkened by radiation, biased into discovery by its brightness, and interpreted through a model that will later be revised. By the time it enters a catalogue, it is already a knot of physical history and observational limitation. A belt cannot describe a knot. It can only hide one. So the title begins to change. Something hiding behind the Kuiper Belt is not merely a set of unseen objects beyond a known region. It is the inadequacy of the known region as a mental container. The hidden thing may be architecture, a wider archive, a separation in the debris, a record of migration, a trace of the sun's lost stellar neighbourhood, or a mistake in how confidently we turned weak detection into a boundary. The hidden thing is not only beyond the belt. It is inside the word belt. A telescope motor adjusts in the cold. A field repeats on a screen. A point shifts where the old population should have thinned. No spectacle follows. No planet rolls into view. Only the shape of a term begins to fail. That failure is valuable. It means the outer solar system is becoming less convenient and more real. It means the map must stop offering the audience a simple ring and start admitting a colder structure. Bands, gaps, survivors, biases, resonances, and causes old enough to have finished their work before Earth had a stable memory of itself. The belt was the first readable sentence. It was not the whole language. Neptune looks innocent because we meet it after the damage. A blue world, remote, slow, almost ceremonial in its distance. It takes so long to orbit the sun that a human life cannot watch it complete even half a year. Through a telescope, it does not look like an ancient engine of disorder. It looks composed. That composure is misleading. The outer solar system still carries Neptune's old force, not as a visible mark, but as timing. Pluto is the famous example. Its orbit crosses inward of Neptune's in a simple drawing, yet the two worlds do not collide because Pluto is locked in a 3-to-2 resonance. For every 3 orbits Neptune makes, Pluto makes 2. The danger is solved by rhythm. Not by distance, by timing. That matters because timing can become architecture. A small icy body can survive for billions of years because it keeps returning to the right part of its orbit when Neptune is elsewhere. Another body can be pushed into instability because a repeated gravitational rhythm slowly stretches its path. Another can be captured during migration, held in a pattern it did not choose, preserved by the same force that removed its neighbours. A resonance is not a place. It is a permission. Allowed paths endure, forbidden paths empty out. The result looks peaceful only because the objects on impossible paths are gone. Stability is what remains after the solar system has finished saying no. Neptune's role in that sorting may have been enormous. The planet likely did not form and remain exactly where we see it now. In many models, the giant planets migrated as they exchanged energy and angular momentum with the disk of small bodies around them. Neptune moved outward through a population of icy planetesimals, scattering some, trapping others, and reshaping the region that would later be named the Kuiper Belt. A planet can move by throwing smaller bodies away. That sentence sounds almost crude, but the accounting is real. Gravity transfers momentum without touch. A small object passes near Neptune and leaves on a different path. Neptune's own orbit changes slightly in response. One encounter means little. Millions of encounters become migration. The planet's modern calm is purchased by the redirected futures of debris. Some bodies were flung inward. Some were lifted outward. Some were caught in resonances. Some were lost beyond recovery. The survivors are not a random crowd. They are the fraction the old violence failed to erase. This is why Neptune belongs inside any serious attempt to understand what may be hiding beyond the Kuiper Belt. If distant objects exist beyond the old decline, they may carry evidence of how far Neptune's influence reached, how migration swept through the disk, and where that influence stopped being enough. The question is not simply whether Neptune shaped the known belt. It did. The sharper question is whether the possible farther population represents the reach of Neptune's old disturbance, the limit of it, or something outside it. Those are different histories. A farther band created by Neptune would imply one kind of migration. A farther band that Neptune cannot easily produce would demand another cause. A gap between the known belt and distant objects might be a cleared zone, a formation feature, a survey artifact, or a boundary between dynamical regimes. The bodies themselves do not explain which answer is right. They only make the old simplicity harder to defend. That is how small objects gain authority. Not by mass, by refusal. They refuse to let Neptune be treated as either irrelevant or omnipotent. The planet is too powerful to ignore and too limited to solve everything. Some trans-Neptunian objects fit beautifully into stories of resonant capture and scattering. Others sit in stranger orbits, detached enough that Neptune's present influence becomes inadequate. The outer solar system is not one crime scene with one culprit. It is a layered record of several disturbances. Neptune is the largest fingerprint. Not the whole hand. Imagine the early outer disk before the cold hardened into stillness. Not a tidy belt beyond a finished planet, but a crowded region of ice, rock, dust, and growing bodies. Neptune moves through it, or the disk moves around a Neptune not yet settled into its present role. Each encounter redirects a future. A small body that might have remained in a local population is thrown outward. Another is lost to the inner system. Another finds a resonant shelter and stays. Another is placed onto a long, eccentric path that takes centuries to reveal its shape. There is no sound there. But there is consequence. If the vacuum could carry the event, it would not be a single crash. It would be a long, granular sorting, a faint scrape of orbits being rewritten. The violence is distributed. No one body matters emotionally in the moment. But after billions of years, the arrangement left behind becomes a record no planet can erase. That record is what telescopes are now trying to read. The difficulty is that Neptune's old work does not come with a signature. A distant object may have been scattered by Neptune, nudged by a resonance, influenced by the other giant planets, altered by collisions, or affected by stellar neighbours when the Sun was young. Survey bias may make some patterns look stronger than they are. Early orbital arcs may be too short to classify with confidence. The farther out the body lies, the more tempting it becomes to turn incomplete data into narrative. That temptation has to be resisted. Neptune's migration is powerful because it is mechanistic, not because it is dramatic. It explains how a giant planet can reshape a debris field without striking it. It explains why a belt can have populations instead of smoothness. It explains why Pluto is not an isolated oddity, but one member of a resonant family. It explains how order can be built from removal. But it does not give us permission to stop asking. A migrated Neptune may create structure. It may also fail to create the exact structure now being hinted at beyond the old belt. If confirmed, distant objects form a separated population. Models will have to pay for that separation. They will have to show how bodies were placed there, how the gap arose, why the distribution survived, and why the present detections look the way they do after the biases of observation are subtracted. The word pay matters. Every explanation must spend physics. A model cannot simply declare a distant population. It must build it from mass, time, gravity, encounters, survival probabilities, and the known architecture of the solar system. A model cannot call a gap meaningful unless it can show how the gap was made or why it appears through the filter of detection. The outer solar system is too cold for loose language. It preserves mistakes almost as well as it preserves evidence. That is the discipline Neptune forces on the story. The blue planet becomes less an endpoint than a test. How much can one migrating giant explain? Where does its authority end? Which small bodies still carry its rhythm and which appear to have slipped beyond its direct grammar? A distant icy object may answer not by speaking, but by refusing to occupy the orbit Neptune would have made easiest. In that refusal, another cause enters the room. Perhaps the sun's birth cluster. Perhaps a broader primordial disk. Perhaps long-term collective effects. Perhaps an unseen mass. Perhaps the plain fact that our census remains too young. This is why the outer solar system grows deeper as the evidence improves. The first question was, are there objects beyond the Kuiper Belt's expected decline? The better question becomes, which histories are permitted by their orbits? That is a harder question because it does not end at detection. It requires classification, statistics, dynamical modelling, and patience across years of follow-up. A dot is only the first syllable, the orbit is the sentence. And Neptune is one of the verbs. Its action continues inside the grammar of small bodies. A resonance can hold a world without touching it. A migration can scatter a population and then vanish from immediate sight. A cleared region can look like emptiness long after the clearing force has settled. Even the word calm becomes suspect. Calm may mean nothing is happening now. It may also mean the destructive motions already succeeded. That is the colder interpretation of order. Order is not always harmony. Sometimes order is aftermath. Seen this way, the Kuiper Belt becomes less like a frozen warehouse and more like a record of selection. The known objects are the ones whose paths remained viable after Neptune and the early disk finished negotiating by gravity. The missing objects may be just as informative as the present ones. A region with few survivors may mark a resonance, an instability, a failure of formation, or the reach of a past disturbance. The far candidates may mark another permitted zone. The solar system begins to look judicial, not moral, but selective. Some motions are allowed to last. Others receive a sentence of collision, ejection, or erasure. The bodies beyond Neptune are the appeals that survived. A telescope cannot see that judgment directly. It sees a faint point moving through cold. It measures position. Later, another position. With enough time, the path emerges. Then the path is compared against what Neptune could have done, what migration models predict, what survey bias permits, and what other bodies suggest. Slowly, the blue planet's old history is tested against the dark. This is why Neptune's beauty becomes almost uncomfortable. The planet itself is not guilty. Guilt belongs to beings with choice. But its gravity helped edit the outer system with a severity no human category can soften. It gave some bodies protection and others exile. It helped turn a disk into a structured debris field. It may have opened gaps, filled resonances, and left distant survivors on paths that still bear the shape of its passing. A former sculptor can look serene when the sculpture is finished. Neptune does. But the sculpture is not finished in knowledge. The possible objects beyond the Kuiper Belt reopen the studio. They force the old blue planet back into motion inside the imagination, not as a distant bead near the edge, but as a migrating giant whose past may be written in bodies too faint to see easily. Each new orbit becomes a question placed against Neptune's authority. Did you move this? Did you spare this? Did you fail to reach this? Or did something older, farther, and less visible write the line you left unfinished? The planet answers only through mathematics. No sound, no confession, only the long rhythm of bodies keeping time around the sun. Somewhere beyond the old belt, a faint object continues its enormous year. Its path may carry Neptune's signature, or the absence of it. Either way, the map has to listen. The blue world at the edge was never just an edge. It was a force that made edges possible. The most misleading darkness is not the darkness that hides something. It is the darkness that lets us think the hiding is over. A hidden planet would be easier to narrate. A single mass, a distant orbit. A cold world pulling small bodies into strange alignments from beyond the reach of ordinary sight. The mind knows what to do with that shape. It gives the mystery a centre. It gives the dark a face. But the deeper problem beyond the Kuiper Belt may have no face at all. It may be a failure of certainty. An object can disappear from our maps without doing anything mysterious. It only has to be small enough, dark enough, distant enough, slow enough, or badly placed against the sky. It can orbit the same sun as Earth and still fall beneath the practical threshold of recognition. Not because the solar system has hidden it with intention, because reality does not arrange itself around our search method. That is the quiet humiliation. The edge may have belonged to our instruments before it belonged to space. Every survey is a physical act with limits. A telescope looks at certain fields, to a certain depth, at certain times, under certain skies. Software searches for motion within expected ranges. Follow-up observations must happen before a faint candidate is lost. Weather interrupts. Moonlight interferes. The Milky Way crowds the background. Telescope time is finite. Even the best search is not a perfect opening of the dark. It is a net. And every net has a shape. That shape matters because the outer solar system does not offer its bodies evenly. An object is easier to detect when it is closer to the Sun and Earth, harder when it is near the far end of a stretched orbit. A reflective surface may enter the catalogue, while a darker object of similar size remains invisible. A body moving at the wrong apparent speed may be filtered out. A tilted orbit may carry a survivor away from regions where surveys have spent the most time. The result can look like architecture. Some of it may be architecture. That is the problem. A real gap and a biased search can overlap. A true decline and a detection limit can occupy the same distance. A distant population can look sparse because it is sparse, or because we are seeing only its brightest members. The outer solar system does not label its absences. It gives us fewer points and lets us decide whether fewer means nature or method. This is where the old map loses innocence. The apparent thinning near the classical Kuiper Belt may still be physically meaningful. It may preserve evidence of Neptune's migration, disk truncation, resonance structure, or ancient disturbance. But once objects appear beyond it, the thinning can no longer be treated as a simple ending. It becomes an unresolved mixture, part possible feature, part possible blind spot, part invitation to search better. The dark did not become brighter. Our confidence became less defensible. That is an upgrade in knowledge. It does not feel like one at first, because human beings prefer discoveries that add objects more than discoveries that damage categories. A new world is satisfying, a new uncertainty is not. Yet science often advances by making the old sentence harder to say. The Kuiper Belt ends around here becomes, the known population appeared to decline in surveys sensitive to certain objects under certain conditions. The second sentence is uglier. It is also closer to truth. There is a kind of beauty in that ugliness. Not visual beauty, Moral beauty, almost. The willingness to make a clean claim more difficult because the evidence requires it. The willingness to let a diagram lose elegance. The willingness to accept that the blank area was not pure knowledge, but partly a mirror held up to our limitations. A telescope does not only reveal the universe, it reveals the contour of its own blindness. Picture the observation again, but strip away the romance. A field of stars, a detector cooled into precision, lines of data, a faint point where thousands of brighter points compete for attention. The first image proves almost nothing. The second gives a possible displacement. The third may rescue the candidate from noise. The fourth begins to suggest a path. Then the work becomes less cinematic, fitting, rejecting, recovering, comparing, correcting. A small shift becomes a body only after doubt has done its work. That doubt is not an obstacle to wonder. It is what makes wonder trustworthy. Without it, every faint point can become a fantasy. With it, the outer solar system becomes stranger in the right way. Not because we have invented drama around it, but because we have denied ourselves easy drama and found the remaining mystery still strong enough to stand. The strongest mystery now is not simply what is beyond the Kuiper Belt. It is what kinds of things our first maps were least able to see. That question changes everything around it. It touches the distant candidates. It touches dust measured by new horizons. It touches the possible atmosphere around small trans-Neptunian bodies. It touches the temptation of a hidden planet. It touches every clean boundary drawn through a region where evidence arrives weakly, slowly, and through selection effects that can impersonate structure. The outer solar system becomes a lesson in epistemology without ever using the word. It asks how knowledge behaves when the subject is faint. It asks when absence becomes evidence. It asks how long uncertainty must be carried before it hardens into a conclusion. It asks whether a line on a map is a feature of nature or the fossil of an old instrument. This is not abstract, it is physical. The answer depends on mirrors, photons, orbital arcs, exposure times, reflected sunlight, sky coverage, detector sensitivity, and the slow return of objects that may take centuries to move around the sun. The philosophy is built from hardware. The humility is made of glass, metal, software, and time. A faint mechanical hum under a dome. A screen repeating the same black field. One point refusing to remain exactly where the background says it should. That refusal is tiny, but it changes the status of silence. Before the point moves, the blank beyond the belt can be imagined as passive. After it moves, the blank becomes charged. It might contain more. It might contain less. It might contain a structure we are only beginning to resolve. The important change is not certainty. It is suspicion aimed in the right direction. The old darkness had been trusted too much. Now it has to testify. Pluto once performed this same humiliation on a smaller scale. It was the edge until it was not. Then it became the famous member of a larger cold population. The correction was difficult because Pluto had entered culture before its context was known. The public felt demotion. Science saw classification catching up with discovery. But the deeper lesson was not about Pluto. It was about the danger of letting the first visible object define the shape of a region. Now the Kuiper Belt itself faces a similar correction. It was the context that rescued Pluto from false loneliness. It may now become the foreground to another, wider context. The correction keeps moving outward, not because astronomers enjoy dismantling maps, but because the solar system keeps resisting the comfort of final edges. Each new edge is more provisional than the last. That should not make the map feel useless. It should make it feel alive. A dead map pretends its borders are finished. A living map marks where its certainty thins. The outer solar system needs a living map because it is built from things that refuse easy visibility. Some bodies are preserved by cold, some are misplaced by gravity, some are hidden by darkness, some are hidden by our own expectations. A complete picture must include not only objects and orbits, but the biases that decided which objects entered the picture first. The method becomes part of the territory. That is the midpoint turn. Not just hidden bodies, hidden assumptions. Not just a farther belt, a closer blindness. The discovery beyond the Kuiper Belt is powerful because it forces those two scales to meet. Billions of kilometers away, a small, icy body follows a path around the Sun. On Earth, an instrument either catches it or does not. Between the object and the catalogue lies a chain of conditions so delicate that the existence of a population can remain partly veiled for decades. The body is physical. The ignorance is physical too. It has weather in it. It has optics in it. It has software thresholds in it. It has human scheduling in it. That makes the final question sharper and less comfortable. When we look into the outer dark and find silence, what exactly has been silent? The solar system? The object? The telescope? The survey design? The model? The assumption that told us where to look and what motion should count? There is no single answer. That is why the dark remains alive. Somewhere beyond Neptune, an icy body moves slowly through a year longer than civilizations. It gives back so little light that the word visible becomes almost too generous. It does not hide. It does not reveal. It simply follows law through distance. The rest is our problem. To build instruments patient enough, models humble enough, and maps unstable enough to let the object become real without forcing it too quickly into a story. A receiver clicks. A candidate is recovered. The edge weakens. And what seemed like empty space becomes something more unsettling than a secret. It becomes a test of whether we know the difference between nothing there and not yet seen. A dead world is easy to imagine because death has a clean shape in the mind. No air. No warmth. No change. A surface locked under cold for billions of years, receiving weak sunlight, gathering dust, absorbing radiation, moving through an orbit so long that human history becomes a brief disturbance near one small star. That picture feels right for the Kuiper Belt. It feels even more right for anything beyond it. But the outer solar system keeps damaging the word dead. Not by becoming alive, by refusing to be simple enough for death. A small icy body beyond Neptune may look inert because nothing obvious is happening when we look. It has no clouds bright enough to see, no oceans, no weather system turning under a blue atmosphere, no continents to fracture into news. It may appear in a telescope as a single point and remain that way for decades. Its light can tell us a little about surface colour, perhaps size, perhaps reflectivity, but the body itself stays hidden behind the poverty of distance. Then it passes in front of a star. For a moment, the star becomes the instrument. This is one of the more delicate acts in astronomy. A distant object moves across the line of sight to a background star. If the object has no atmosphere, the star should vanish sharply, cut off by the hard edge of the body. But if the starlight fades gradually, if it bends or dims before the surface blocks it completely, then something else is present. A thin layer of gas has touched the light first. Not a sky as Earth knows sky. A skin. A mathematical breath. That is why the case of 2002 XV93 matters so much. The object is small by planetary standards, an icy trans-Neptunian body only hundreds of kilometers across. It is not the kind of world that should easily command atmosphere in the human imagination. It does not have Pluto's fame. It does not have Titan's orange haze. It does not have Triton's strange captured grandeur. It is modest, faint, remote. And yet occultation data has suggested a thin atmosphere around it. That possibility is not dramatic because the atmosphere is thick. It is dramatic because it is barely there. A pressure measured in nanobars is almost nothing beside Earth's air. The atmosphere around your face now presses with a familiarity so constant that the body forgets it is being held. Your lungs depend on that pressure. Your blood depends on it. Your hearing, weather, flight, fire, scent, clouds, breath, and speech all live inside that invisible weight. Around 2002 XV93, the proposed gas layer would be millions of times thinner. Too thin for wind. Too thin for breathing. Too thin for sound. If you passed through it in a suit, the body would not call it air. It would be closer to a temporary disagreement between surface and space. A few molecules not yet frozen, not yet escaped, lingering around a small object that seems too cold and too weak to keep them for long. That is what makes it severe. A thick atmosphere can announce itself. A thin one has to be inferred from the way it alters another light. It does not give you clouds. It gives you curvature. It does not become weather. It becomes a hesitation in a star's disappearance. A blink with physics inside. The question is not only whether the atmosphere is there. The harder question is how it is paid for. In the outer solar system, nothing gets to be mysterious for free. Gas must come from somewhere. It must be retained, replenished, or recently exposed. If an atmosphere around a small body cannot survive for long against escape and freezing, then its presence implies timing. Something may have happened recently by geological standards. A collision may have struck the surface and exposed buried volatiles. A crack may have opened. Internal heat, weak but not absent, may have helped drive material upward. A pocket of frozen chemistry may have found a pathway into vacuum. Each possibility has weight. Each also has a cost. An impact is not just a word. It means another body arrived with enough energy to break the crust, throw material outward, and disturb a surface that might have rested for immense spans of time. There would be no thunder, no spreading fire, no atmosphere to carry shock as sound. Just motion converted into fracture, ice becoming powder, subsurface material suddenly seeing the sky for the first time since the solar system was young. A muted violence. A granular burst. A brief release around a world with almost no voice. Cryovolcanism is stranger because it borrows the emotional shape of a volcano while rejecting almost everything the word volcano suggests on Earth. No red lava, no glowing mountain, no ash cloud rolling over villages. In cold world terms, the eruption may involve water, ammonia, nitrogen, methane, carbon monoxide, or other volatiles moving through ice under pressures and temperatures that turn geology into something quieter and more alien. A sealed body leaks. Not fire from stone. Cold from beneath. Cold. That image is almost too elegant, which makes caution necessary. A beautiful explanation can still be wrong. The outer solar system has punished elegant explanations before. The possible atmosphere must be confirmed and interpreted carefully. Surface composition matters. Thermal history matters. Escape rates matter. The object's size, mass, orbit, and volatile inventory matter. A single occultation signal, however compelling, must be folded into a larger physical account. But even caution changes the map, because the old emotional category has been weakened. A small trans-Neptunian body can no longer be treated automatically as a passive dot with an orbit attached. It may still be mostly inactive. It may be dormant for nearly all of its life. But under the right geometry, the right disturbance, or the right hidden supply, it can reveal behavior that was not obvious from position alone. Location is not character. An orbit is not a surface. A catalogue entry is not a world. That distinction reaches back toward the newly found distant objects beyond the Kuiper Belt. If the outer solar system can hide bodies through faintness, it can also hide behavior through rarity. Some processes may occur too weakly, too briefly, or too unpredictably to appear in ordinary observations. A body can spend centuries looking unchanged, then betray an atmosphere during one stellar alignment. Another can shed dust too faintly to be linked to its source. Another can carry an impact scar we will never resolve, while its orbit alone remains readable from Earth. The outer solar system does not lack events. It lacks frequent witnesses. This is why stillness becomes a dangerous visual assumption. The farther a body lies from the sun, the easier it is to call it frozen and finished. Cold suggests preservation. Preservation suggests inactivity. Inactivity suggests simplicity. The chain feels natural, but every link is weak. Preservation can coexist with rare change. Cold can slow processes without abolishing them. A surface can remain ancient while isolated disturbances open young wounds. The mistake is not saying these bodies are cold. They are. The mistake is letting cold become a synonym for understood. Pluto already warned us. Before New Horizons, it was possible to imagine Pluto as a frozen relic with limited drama. Then the spacecraft arrived and found mountains of water ice, plains of nitrogen ice, hazes, varied terrain, and surfaces that did not match the easiest expectation of ancient stillness. Pluto was not made interesting by our arrival, it had been interesting the whole time. Distance had merely compressed its complexity into a dot. Arakoth gave a different lesson. It did not reveal a world of active geology, it revealed delicacy. Two lobes joined in a shape that suggested gentle accumulation rather than catastrophic impact. Its power was not in violence but in preserved formation. The outer solar system could surprise both ways, through unexpected activity and unexpected quiet. That range matters. Because a region that can hold Pluto, Arakoth, distant candidates beyond the known belt, and a possible temporary atmosphere around 2002 XV93 is not a graveyard in any simple sense. It is a cold archive with different kinds of pages. Some pages preserve formation, some preserve migration, some preserve impact, some may preserve rare physical activity. Some are still sealed because no star has passed behind them at the right moment. A graveyard implies finished stories. An archive implies unread ones. The atmosphere case also changes how the word small feels. Size does not stop matter from having history. A body only a few hundred kilometers across can still have layers, fractures, volatile reservoirs, impact scars, rotational states, surface chemistry, and a dynamical past. It can be too small to dominate its region and still large enough to complicate a theory. Its weakness becomes part of the puzzle. If gravity is too weak to keep gas for long, the gas demands a recent or ongoing source. The body's limitation becomes evidence. That is a useful reversal. A powerful world can hide mechanisms behind abundance. A weak world makes every mechanism answer for itself. Around a small icy object, atmosphere is not expected to be casual. It is fragile, temporary, suspicious. It does not invite wonder by existing beautifully. It invites investigation by existing at all. And if further observations revise or weaken the atmosphere interpretation, the lesson does not vanish entirely. The lesson is that the physical nature of these bodies cannot be read from distance alone. Occultations, spectra, thermal measurements, spacecraft encounters, and careful monitoring can each reveal dimensions a simple orbit cannot. The outer solar system is not one mystery, it is many mysteries stacked behind the same faintness. Objects hide. Processes hide. Our assumptions hide between them. That stack is what makes the title deepen. Something hiding behind the Kuiper Belt is not only a set of distant bodies, it is an entire regime of weak evidence, rare alignments, slow motion, and physical behavior that almost never receives the conditions needed to become visible. A thin atmosphere around a small object is a reminder that, even when we know where something is, we may still not know what it is capable of doing. The map can locate a body and still miss its weather. If weather is even the right word. For 2002 XV93, the better word may be episode. A temporary state. A fragile envelope. A short-lived consequence of an event we did not see. The thought is unsettling because it makes the outer dark less static without making it loud. Nothing there becomes theatrical. No storm fills a disk. No plume announces itself across human culture. The drama remains almost invisible. starlight bending by a tiny amount around a small body in a remote orbit. A star dims softly. A curve refuses the hard edge of stone. A world that should have been only surface becomes surface plus question. That is enough to change the silence. Because once stillness has been caught failing, it can no longer be trusted as easily. The distant candidates beyond the belt may be only dots today, their surfaces unknown, their compositions uncertain, their histories mostly inferred. But each dot now carries a larger possibility space. Not fantasy, not permission to invent, a disciplined possibility that cold bodies can preserve, move, leak, collide, darken, brighten, and occasionally reveal themselves through geometries rare enough to make discovery feel like luck. Luck is part of the instrumentation, not luck instead of science. Luck disciplined by prediction, timing, and measurement. An occultation must be forecast, telescopes must be placed in the right shadow path, timing must be precise, the star must be bright enough, the object's position must be known well enough, the data must be clean enough to separate atmosphere from other effects. What looks like a cosmic accident is actually a meeting between chance and preparation. The outer solar system yields to that kind of patience, not conquest. Patience. A background star becomes a probe, a faint body becomes an atmosphere test, a momentary dimming becomes a physical claim. Then the claim enters the long discipline of confirmation, argument, and revision. That is how the dead-looking dark becomes complicated without becoming exaggerated. The old image was a frozen outskirts. The better image is colder and less still. A region where most change is too slow to notice, some change is too rare to catch, and the evidence for both may arrive as a tiny bend in light from a star that has nothing to do with the object except being briefly behind it. The darkness did not cut the light cleanly. It curved it. And in that curve, the outer solar system breathed just enough to ruin the word dead. A strange object is not an answer. It is a debt. That is the discipline the outer solar system demands again and again. A faint body appears beyond the old Kuiper Belt boundary, and the question is not only whether it exists, it is how the solar system paid for its existence there. A thin atmosphere seems to surround a small trans-Neptunian object, and the question is not only whether the gas is real, it is what supplied it, what kept it, what disturbed it, and why the evidence became visible now. The cold does not forgive loose explanations. Every feature must be funded by physics. If a population exists around 70 to 90 astronomical units, it cannot be waved into place by wonder. It must have formed there, been moved there, or survived there through a history capable of producing the pattern we see. Each route has a cost. Each cost exposes a different early solar system. Formation in place sounds calm until distance is allowed to speak. Far from the Sun, the original disk would have been thinner. Material would have been spread across larger orbits. Encounters between growing bodies would have been slower and less frequent. Building even modest icy worlds before the gas and dust dispersed would require a disk generous enough to make growth possible in a region where time itself begins to work against assembly. A native distant belt would not be a gentle discovery. It would be a larger birth certificate. It would say the young solar system may have had more material, or a broader nursery, or different growth conditions than the simplified edge allowed. The faint objects would not be debris pushed into exile. They would be local survivors from a colder beginning. Their presence would force the origin story outward, making the Sun's early disk wider in consequence, if not always in mass. That is one way to pay the debt. Another is movement. The bodies may have formed closer in, where material was denser and growth easier, then been scattered outward by the migrating giant planets. Neptune is the obvious force in that version, but not a gentle one. Scattering is not placement, it is risk. A small body passing near a giant planet can have its orbit stretched, lifted, or broken open into escape. Too little energy, and it remains near the known belt. Too much, and it leaves the sun entirely. To strand a body far out, gravity must be violent with restraint. That phrase sounds human, but the balance is physical. A survivor beyond the belt would imply encounters strong enough to relocate it and weak enough not to erase it from the system. A whole population there would require that balance to happen not once, but often enough to leave a detectable residue. The gap between the known belt and the possible further population would then become part of the same transaction, a record of where paths were not allowed to last, or where bodies became harder to keep. The objects would be refugees from an older architecture, not in the sentimental sense, in the dynamical sense. Their orbits would carry the memory of displacement. A third payment reaches outside the modern solar system. The sun probably did not form alone. Stars are usually born in clusters, surrounded by siblings that later drift away. In that earlier crowd, a passing star could have tugged at the outer disk, disturbed distant material, truncated some regions, or helped detach bodies from Neptune's easy control. The star would be gone now. Its path would not be visible in the night sky. It would have no name in human history. But the debris might still remember the encounter. That is the eerie possibility hidden in the farthest small bodies. They may preserve not only the motion of planets, but the vanished neighbourhood of the sun. A cold object beyond the Kuiper Belt could be carrying a gravitational signature from a star that passed near our system before Earth was a habitable world, before Earth was even close to becoming the world that would one day look back. The present solitude of the sun may be misleading. Its outskirts may still carry the pressure of company. Then there is the explanation that always tries to become the whole story. An unseen planet. A massive body beyond Neptune would have the narrative shape people want. It could shepherd orbits, create alignments, detach objects, and turn distant disorder into the shadow of one dark ruler. The idea is not foolish. Gravity can reveal what light has not yet found. Neptune itself entered human knowledge through the mathematics of disturbance before it entered the telescope as a visible planet. But history gives warnings as well as victories. The sky has more than one way to imitate a planet. Survey bias can make clusters appear where none exist. Small samples can look more meaningful than they are. Distant bodies are found unevenly because telescopes look unevenly, because objects brighten unevenly, because orbits place them in favourable or unfavourable parts of the sky. A hidden planet remains possible only if the pattern survives the punishment of better data. Possible is not the same as necessary. And necessary is the standard that matters. A planet should not be allowed to devour every clue simply because it gives the mystery a face. If a farther Kuiper Belt population is real, it may test the hidden planet idea, but it also tests broader disk formation, Neptune's migration, stellar encounters, dust production, and detection bias. The outer solar system may not be waiting for a monarch. It may be governed by older and less satisfying causes layered together. That is often how reality avoids our preferred stories. Not by being less strange, by being less centered. The same caution applies to the possible atmosphere around 2002X V93. The first temptation is to make it magical, a tiny world where no atmosphere should exist, breathing in the dark. The better version is harder and stronger. A gas layer, if confirmed, must be sustained, replenished, or recently produced. It cannot simply hover as a mood. It must be paid for in volatile inventory, escape rate, temperature, gravity, impact history, internal heat, or some combination we have not yet modelled well. A thin atmosphere is not a decoration. It is an expense. An impact can pay part of it. Imagine not a fireball, because there is no air to make fire behave the way it does on Earth, but motion slamming into brittle cold. A crater opens. Dark ice fractures. Buried material sees vacuum for the first time in perhaps millions or billions of years. Some molecules freeze back almost at once. Some escape. Some linger briefly as a fragile envelope around a body too small to keep them comfortably. A brief gas skin could be the afterimage of violence. But the timing must work. The released material must be recent enough or replenished enough to still be there. The impact rate must not be invented for convenience. The body's gravity must be able to hold what the interpretation requires, even temporarily. The surface composition must cooperate, or else the explanation begins spending materials the object may not have. Cryovolcanism can pay another way, but it has its own debts. A cold body can release material from beneath its surface if internal conditions allow pressure, pathways, and stored volatiles to meet. But that asks for heat on a world where heat is scarce. It asks for fractures. It asks for insulation. It asks for a reason the body did not simply finish cooling into silence long ago. Cold volcanism is not an escape from physics. It is a more difficult physics. A sealed archive can leak, but the crack must have a cause. This is the pattern across the whole outer system. The strange thing never arrives alone. It arrives with invoices attached. Distant population, pay in formation, migration or disturbance. Gap, pay in clearing, bias, resonance or disk structure. Atmosphere, pay in supply and retention. Dust, pay in collisions, sources and lifetimes. Orbital clustering, pay in hidden mass, selection effects, or some other mechanism strong enough to survive statistical attack. The outer solar system is not mysterious because it ignores rules. It is mysterious because the rules, followed carefully, leave several expensive possibilities standing. That is more difficult than a miracle. A miracle ends inquiry. A debt extends it. Picture the far debris field not as a collection of isolated curiosities, but as a cold accounting system. Every object in the catalogue occupies a line: distance, brightness, colour, orbit, inclination, possible composition, discovery bias, dynamical class. Every missing region occupies another line: not found here, not yet found here, hard to find here, possibly cleared here, possibly never populated here. The ledger is incomplete, but it is not empty. The silence has entries. New Horizons adds different entries. A dust impact is small, almost insulting in scale beside worlds and belts. Yet dust may be what bodies become when collisions grind them slowly below the threshold of naming. A spacecraft detector feeling more dust than expected can hint at a population too faint or too distributed to see directly. Dust is not the architecture. It is the architecture wearing down. A grain is a ruin with velocity. That is why the outer solar system refuses the clean division between active and dead. Most of its bodies are not active in the lush planetary sense. They do not have storms, oceans, or erupting mountains visible across space. But they are not necessarily finished. They collide, they shed, they darken, they fracture, they preserve. They occasionally expose buried chemistry. They move through resonances. They respond to old gravity long after the violence itself has ended. Matter does not need to be alive to have a history. It only needs to change under law. The strongest explanations will have to connect these histories without forcing them into one script. A broader primordial disk may explain some distant bodies. Neptune's migration may explain others. Stellar encounters may help detach still farther populations. Impacts may explain temporary gas. Survey limits may explain part of the apparent gap. An unseen planet may remain relevant only if the orbits keep demanding it after less glamorous causes have been tested. The truth may be a mixture, with no single dramatic centre. That is not a weakness. It is what an old system should look like. A young wound can have one cause. A 4.5 billion-year-old architecture is rarely that obedient. It has been touched by formation, migration, collision, radiation, escape, preservation, and observation itself. By the time the evidence reaches Earth as faint light or delayed telemetry, it has passed through both physical history and human filtering. A model that ignores either one will lie. The cold field beyond Neptune, therefore, becomes a place where restraint is not a reduction of awe. Restraint is the only path into it. To say maybe is not to weaken the story when maybe is what the evidence supports. To hold several explanations open is not indecision when the system itself may have several authors. To refuse a premature hidden planet is not cowardice. It is respect for gravity, bias, and time. The dark does not need our exaggeration. It has enough pressure of its own. A small object far beyond the known belt follows its orbit without declaring which theory it favours. A body with a possible atmosphere carries gas so thin that only a star behind it can make the gas visible. A spacecraft crosses a region where dust becomes an argument. A telescope returns to the same fields because one image cannot separate world from noise. No single clue is sovereign. Together, they tighten the room. The old version of the outer solar system was spacious in the wrong way. It was spacious because it seemed empty. The newer version is spacious in a more demanding way. It contains more mechanisms than comfort allows, more possible histories, more ways for small evidence to injure large assumptions, more places where the map must become less elegant to become less false. That is why the mystery deepens instead of resolves. The distant bodies do not say, "Here is the answer." The atmosphere does not say, "Here is the answer." The dust does not say, "Here is the answer." They say something better. Account for this. And in science, that is often the most powerful sentence the universe can give. A hidden planet is the kind of answer that arrives before it has been invited. The mind reaches for it almost automatically. Something strange is happening beyond Neptune. Some small bodies occupy extreme orbits. Some appear detached from the easier reach of known planets. A possible population may lie beyond the old Kuiper Belt boundary. A gap may separate one region of debris from another. The outer solar system begins to look organized in ways that a simple fading disk may not explain comfortably. Then one idea enters with dangerous elegance. A planet in the dark. Cold. Massive. Almost invisible. Far beyond Neptune, moving so slowly that generations could pass before its orbit revealed much of itself. Heavy enough to tug small bodies into patterns, dim enough to escape ordinary detection. The idea has gravity before the object does. That is why it must be handled carefully. Not dismissed. Not crowned. Held at the proper distance. A hidden planet would make the story easier to tell. It would give the darkness a central actor. It would convert scattered clues into the shadow of one body. It would let the public imagination replace uncertainty with a figure, a lost world, a dark shepherd, a ninth planet waiting beyond the map. The outer solar system does not owe us that satisfaction. It may contain such a planet. It may not. The evidence has to decide without being pressured by the beauty of the answer. Astronomy has earned the right to take invisible gravity seriously. Neptune itself was not discovered by accident in the ordinary sense. Its existence was inferred from the way Uranus failed to move exactly as expected. The planet entered mathematics before it entered the eyepiece. That history matters because it proves a profound thing. A world can be found first by the trouble it causes. But one true story can become a dangerous instinct. Not every trouble is a planet. Mercury's orbit once seemed to hint at an unseen inner world called Vulcan. That world never appeared. The problem was not a missing planet, it was a missing theory. General relativity changed the meaning of Mercury's motion without adding another body to the map. Pluto too entered the story through a search shaped by expectations of a distant planet X, but Pluto was far too small to be the gravitational culprit imagined at the time. The history is not a simple hymn to prediction. It is a warning about desire. Sometimes the sky rewards the search for a hidden mass. Sometimes it exposes the hunger behind the search. That hunger is especially strong beyond Neptune because the region is faint enough to let imagination breathe too freely. A distant planet would not have to look dramatic. It could be extremely dim, reflecting weak sunlight from enormous distance. It might appear as only another faint point, one that moves across the background so slowly that repeated observations over long intervals would be needed to confirm its nature. The very difficulty makes it more seductive. Absence stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like concealment. But concealment is not evidence. Difficulty is not evidence. A cold region can hide a planet and still not contain one. The strongest arguments for a possible distant planet do not come from romance. They come from orbital behaviour. Certain extreme trans-Neptunian objects have paths that seem difficult to explain through ordinary Neptune scattering alone. Some models have suggested that a massive planet far beyond Neptune could shepherd orbits, raise perihelia, produce alignments, and create a distant dynamical structure. In that version, the unseen planet is not a decoration added to the mystery. It is a mechanism. Mechanisms deserve respect. They also deserve attack. A good hypothesis must be vulnerable. It must make predictions sharp enough that new data can wound it. It must survive survey bias, small number statistics, alternative dynamical models, and the slow arrival of better orbital arcs. If the apparent clustering of distant objects weakens as more are found, the planet becomes less necessary. If new objects strengthen the pattern in ways surveys cannot easily fake, the case grows heavier. The planet, if real, should not merely explain yesterday's discomfort. It should risk tomorrow's data. That is where the discipline lies. A hidden planet is not proven by the feeling that the outer solar system is strange. Strange is not enough. Many things can make a distant population look strange. Neptune's migration can scatter and detach bodies. The Sun's birth cluster may have disturbed the early outskirts. Passing stars can alter distant orbits. The galactic environment can act on the farthest bodies over long intervals. Collisions can reshape populations. Survey selection can make random or ordinary distributions look patterned. The sky can imitate design. The instrument can imitate structure. The sample can imitate law. This is the central danger. A pattern in the catalogue may not be a pattern in space. Objects are not discovered evenly. Surveys look more deeply in some directions. Bodies are easier to find when they are nearer perihelion. Bright surfaces enter the record before dark ones. High inclination objects may be undercounted if searches concentrate near the ecliptic. A handful of discoveries can appear to lean one way, simply because the search itself leaned that way. A net can teach you about fish. It can also teach you the shape of the net. In the outer solar system, both lessons arrive together. That is why every claim about an unseen planet must keep the survey history close. Where did telescopes look? How deep did they go? Which objects would they have missed? What motions were the software tuned to detect? Which discoveries were followed up well enough to preserve their orbits? Which were lost? Which regions of the sky remain poorly searched? The planet question is not only astronomical. It is methodological. It asks whether gravity is arranging the small bodies, or whether our way of finding small bodies has arranged the evidence. That does not make the hidden planet idea weak by default. It makes the standard higher. The more satisfying an explanation feels, the more carefully it must be stripped of satisfaction. The possible planet has to stand after the myth has been removed. No dark throne, no cosmic monarch, no lost world waiting for human recognition. Only mass, orbit, perturbation, prediction, detection limits, and the stubborn question of necessity. Necessity is the word that matters. An unseen planet can be interesting without being necessary. It can be plausible without being proven. It can explain some patterns while failing to explain the whole system. And even if such a planet were found, it would not simplify the outer solar system as much as the imagination wants. It would add a major actor, not erase the stage. Neptune's migration would still matter. The primordial disk would still matter. Stellar encounters would still matter. Dust would still matter. Survey bias would still matter. The possible extension of the Kuiper Belt would still require population statistics, composition studies, and dynamical histories. A planet would be a revelation. It would not be a solvent. It would not dissolve every other question into one answer. That is the mature way to hold it. Let the possibility remain powerful without letting it become greedy. Let it press on the evidence without consuming evidence that belongs to other mechanisms. Let it stay in the room as one serious hypothesis among several, not because it is less exciting, but because reality is under no obligation to organize itself around the cleanest narrative. Picture such a planet only as far as the evidence allows. If it exists, it would move through a darkness where the sun is more command than warmth. Its year could be so long that human history would barely mark a fraction of its path. Its surface or atmosphere, if it has one, would be shaped by cold beyond ordinary imagination. It might have moons. It might not. It might be a captured body, a scattered core, a remnant of planet formation, or something stranger in detail than the phrase Planet 9 can carry. But those are possibilities, not possessions. The telescope has not placed that world in the hand. Until it does, the planet remains a question written in other bodies. That is a strange form of existence, to be considered not because you are seen, but because smaller objects may be behaving as if you are there. A gravitational ghost, a possible author of curves. Yet ghosts are easy to multiply where evidence is thin. The better the instruments become, the fewer ghosts deserve to survive. This is why the newly detected distant candidates matter so much. They are not merely additions to a list, they may become tests. Their orbits, once refined, could strengthen a hidden planet model, weaken it, or point toward a different structure altogether. A far population broadly distributed may say one thing. A population aligned in a very specific way may say another. A gap with certain properties may support one mechanism and injure another. The small bodies become judges. Not individually, collectively. One orbit can mislead. A population can constrain. A well-characterized survey can separate pattern from bias. That is the path from speculation toward knowledge. Not a single dramatic announcement, but an accumulating court of faint witnesses, each one carrying a piece of the dynamical record. The planet must answer to them, not the other way around. This reverses the popular story. The hidden planet is often treated as the grand answer and the small bodies as clues beneath it. But scientifically, the small bodies are the evidence. They are what we have. Their motion is the testimony. The planet, if it exists, is an inference forced by that testimony, only if other explanations fail or remain less compelling. The debris is not secondary. The debris is the witness stand. And witnesses can disagree. Some may fit Neptune's old influence, some may suggest stellar disturbance, some may be explained by observational bias, some may eventually support a distant planet. The final architecture may not have the clean emotional unity of a single culprit. It may be a layered verdict, part migration, part primordial structure, part survey correction, part external perturbation, perhaps part unseen mass. That answer would be harder to sell. It would also sound more like an ancient system. A 4.5 billion-year-old debris field should not be expected to preserve one cause in isolation. Its present shape has passed through formation, migration, resonance, impact, radiation, escape, and observation. Every faint point in the catalogue has survived both physical history and the selection effects of being noticed. By the time the data reaches us, it is already double-filtered, once by the solar system, once by the search. The hidden planet must survive both filters. A quiet room years from now may decide more than any dramatic headline. A researcher compares new distant objects found by a deeper survey. The screen does not show a planet, it shows orbital arcs, perihelia, inclinations, longitudes, bias corrections. The air conditioner gives a low hiss. Outside, the planet Earth rotates under ordinary weather. Inside, a possible world either gains necessity or loses it. If the pattern sharpens, the dark grows heavier. If it dissolves, the dark becomes no less interesting. That second possibility is important. The absence of a hidden planet would not make the outer solar system boring. it would make the other mechanisms more powerful. It would say that migration, disk structure, stellar history, collisions, and detection bias can create an architecture strange enough to tempt us toward a planet that was not there. That would be a profound result. It would reveal not a missing world, but the capacity of old gravity and imperfect observation to counterfeit one. A false planet can still teach. It teaches the danger of narrative gravity. The mind is pulled toward the answer with a face. A planet has a horizon, even if unseen. A bias does not. A migration history does not. A primordial disk condition does not. A stellar encounter from the sun's lost nursery does not. Yet faceless causes can be just as real, and often more responsible. The universe is not required to be memorable in human terms. That is why restraint is not an enemy of wonder here. It is the only way to keep wonder from becoming a myth with equations attached. The possible hidden planet should remain possible. The search should continue. The models should sharpen. The surveys should widen. But the phrase should not be allowed to harden into belief before the sky has paid it. Somewhere beyond Neptune, small bodies continue moving. They do not care what explanation we prefer. They do not arrange themselves for narrative clarity. Their orbits carry whatever happened, not whatever satisfies. If a distant planet is among the causes, the bodies will keep its signature. If not, they will eventually withdraw that privilege from the idea. That is the patience the subject demands. The dark may contain a planet. It may contain no planet. Either way, the more important truth is already visible. The edge of the solar system cannot be understood by wanting one answer loudly enough. It must be read through faint motions, corrected searches, wounded models, and the discipline to let small bodies speak before the grand explanation enters. A hidden planet would be astonishing, but a hidden assumption can be just as powerful. And sometimes the harder discovery is not a world in the dark. It is the moment we realize we were using a world-shaped story to cover a darkness that had many authors. A cold object can be more than debris. It can be a piece of time that avoided becoming something else. That is difficult to feel from Earth, because Earth teaches the wrong lesson about importance. Here the meaningful things are active. Clouds move, oceans rise, forests burn and return, continents shift, cities grow over older cities, bodies decay into soil. Memory depends on change, and change depends on warmth. Our world is alive because it refuses to stay itself. But that refusal has a cost. Earth is a poor keeper of beginnings. The planet that made life possible also destroyed much of its oldest record. Its crust was folded, melted, buried, subducted, weathered, drowned, uplifted, fractured, and overgrown. Rain carved evidence down, rivers carried it away, volcanoes returned buried chemistry to the surface. Plate tectonics recycled whole floors of ocean. Biology entered the archive and made it richer, but also less clean. Earth remembers by rewriting. The outer solar system remembers differently. It remembers by not being chosen. A small icy body beyond Neptune did not become a planet. It did not grow large enough to melt deeply, differentiate cleanly, build a thick atmosphere, or spend its interior heat through active geology in the way larger worlds can. It did not become Earth or Mars or Neptune. It remained minor, remote, poorly lit, and cold. In human status, that sounds like failure. In planetary history, it can be preservation. Not purity. That word would be too easy. No body exposed to space for billions of years remains untouched. Radiation darkens surfaces, micrometeorites churn the crust. Impacts break, bury, and expose. Ices migrate when temperature and orbit allow. Chemistry still works, but under slow rules. These objects are not sealed museum specimens. They are archives left outside in cosmic weather. But the weather is thin. And the cold is patient. That patience matters. A surface in the outer solar system can preserve relationships the inner worlds have erased. Its colour may hold traces of radiation chemistry. Its composition may hint at the mixture of ices and organics present in the early disk. Its craters may carry a record of impacts from populations that no longer look the same. Its shape may tell how gently or violently pieces first came together. Its orbit may preserve the strongest message of all: where it formed, where it was moved, and which forces failed to remove it. An orbit is not scenery. It is memory with no need for language. This is why the distant candidates beyond the known Kuiper Belt carry more weight than their faintness suggests. A body at 70 or 80 astronomical units is not merely a small object in a larger circle. It is a possible page in an older archive, one we had not known how to shelve. If it belongs to a farther population, then the archive extends past the section we had been reading. If it sits beyond a gap, then the archive includes a missing chapter whose absence may itself be evidence. The old map treated debris as background. The new question makes debris into testimony. That shift is important because the planets are not always the best witnesses to planet formation. They are the loudest outcomes, not necessarily the clearest records. Jupiter is immense, but its very immensity hides the smaller history of what it consumed and displaced. Earth is meaningful beyond measure, but it has transformed itself too thoroughly to preserve its first pages intact. Even Mars, colder and quieter than Earth, carries the complications of atmosphere loss, volcanism, impacts, water, dust, and time. Small icy bodies have less grandeur. They also have fewer ways to lie. A fragment beyond Neptune may hold primitive materials, not because it is perfect, but because it was denied the furnace. It was left far from the part of the system where sunlight could drive rapid change and gravity could assemble the largest monuments. Its significance lies in deprivation: less heat, less processing, less erasure, less fame. A world can become scientifically precious because almost nothing happened to improve it. That is a strange sentence. It is also the heart of the archive. Consider Arakoth, the small Kuiper Belt object visited by New Horizons after Pluto. Before the encounter, it was a distant target, faint and technical, meaningful mostly to people who understood why such a body mattered. Then the spacecraft flew past and revealed two lobes joined together, a shape that suggested gentle accumulation rather than a catastrophic collision. The object did not impress by being large. It impressed by preserving a texture of formation. Its quietness became the evidence. That lesson should remain beside the new, distant detections. The outer solar system is not valuable only when it becomes active or strange. It is also valuable when it remains still enough to keep a record of gentler beginnings. Planet formation is often imagined as violence, impacts, scattering, migration, worlds smashing into worlds. Much of that is true, but not every step was a blow. Some bodies may have formed by slow accumulation, by low-speed contact, by pieces meeting softly enough that the finished shape still remembers the manner of the meeting. The archive contains violence. It also contains tenderness without intention. That contrast matters because it prevents the story from becoming monotonous. The outer solar system is not simply a graveyard of cold leftovers. It is not simply a battlefield frozen after the war. It is not simply a storehouse of untouched originals. It is all of these imperfectly, depending on the body, the orbit, the surface, and the history that placed it there. A resonant object may remember Neptune's timing. A scattered object may remember displacement. A detached object may remember release from a planet's easy control. A contact binary may remember gentle assembly. A body with temporary gas may remember an impact or an interior leak. A distant population may remember the true reach of the early disk. The archive does not speak with one voice. It is a chorus of constraints. This is why a single new object can begin as almost nothing and end by pressuring a whole model. Its brightness asks about size and reflectivity. Its color asks about surface chemistry. Its motion asks about distance. Its orbit asks about origin. Its membership in a population asks about structure. Each answer is partial. Each partial answer changes the value of the next question. That is how the archive becomes readable. Not by one object becoming famous, by many faint objects becoming difficult to ignore together. A shard found alone can be beautiful and meaningless. A shard found in context can date a layer, identify a culture, reveal a trade route, or expose a collapse. The same principle holds in the cold. A lone, icy body beyond the belt is intriguing. A group in related orbits becomes architecture. A gap between groups becomes a mechanism waiting to be found. A distribution, once corrected for bias, becomes history. The pattern is the text. The objects are letters. The missing letters also matter. That is the part ordinary wonder often misses. It wants the discovered thing. Science also wants the undiscovered region shaped around it. Why here? Why not there? Why this brightness? Why this orbital tilt? Why this distance? Why this survival? In the outer solar system, absence and presence have to be read together because both may have been carved by the same old forces. A body beyond the old Kuiper Belt edge is therefore not just an addition. It is a revision mark. It tells us the archive may continue beyond the shelf where our earlier surveys became weak. It tells us the solar system's early record may be wider, more broken, more layered, or more biased in discovery than the classroom sequence implied. It tells us that the cold outskirts are not peripheral just because they are dim. They are peripheral only to warmth. Not to origin. That reversal pulls Earth back into the frame. The water in blood, the oxygen in breath, the calcium in bone, the carbon in thought, the metals in machines, all belong to the same ancient system that left those frozen fragments behind. The outer bodies are not unrelated relics. They are alternate survivors of the same beginning. Earth became restless and alive. They remained cold and distant. Both outcomes emerged from one disk around one young sun. One branch spent its inheritance on change. The other kept receipts in the dark. That is why the word leftover has to be handled carefully. It can sound dismissive, as if these bodies are the scraps after the real construction finished. But leftovers are sometimes the only part of a process that still shows the original ingredients. The planets are the finished meal, altered by pressure, heat, mixing and time. The distant debris may still hold traces of the flour. Not enough to reconstruct everything. Enough to make arrogance dangerous. The archive is also humbling, because it does not know it is an archive. The bodies beyond Neptune do not preserve themselves for us. They do not carry messages, warnings, or meanings aimed at intelligence. Their value is not intentional. It is accidental and therefore clean. They remained because their paths allowed them to remain. They recorded because physics made recording possible. They testify because we learned how to ask. There is no romance in their motive. There is no motive. That absence makes them more trustworthy. A human record can flatter, omit, justify, mourn, deceive. A stone tool can be misplaced. A chronicle can serve power. A monument can lie about the hands that built it. But an orbit has no vanity. A surface scar has no ideology. A volatile trapped in ice does not exaggerate. The difficulty is not that the evidence wants to mislead us. The difficulty is that we are tempted to read it too quickly. The archive is honest. Our interpretation has to earn the same right. A telescope turns again. The dome gives a low mechanical sigh. Another field is exposed, not because one image is enough, but because archives do not open to impatience. Far beyond the atmosphere, New Horizons carries the memory of Arakoth in its data, and the dust of the region in its instruments. Somewhere beyond the familiar belt, a faint object moves through a year no civilization can feel from beginning to end. It does not shine with meaning. It permits meaning to be extracted. That is a colder, better kind of awe. The object remains itself, No myth is required. It is not a monster behind the Kuiper Belt, not a messenger, not a secret placed for discovery. It is matter following law through time, and by doing so, it has preserved a fragment of the story that warmer worlds could not keep. The inner solar system shows what the beginning became. The outer solar system may show what the beginning was made of. And if the newly detected bodies truly mark a farther structure, then the archive is not only deeper than we knew, it is organised differently than we assumed. The book does not end at the chapter we last managed to read. There may be another page beyond the old pale margin, written in frozen bodies that never became important enough to erase themselves. A world can testify simply by lasting. Out there, beyond Neptune's old grammar, and beyond the belt's too clean name, something small continues to last. It carries no label that matters to itself. No sound follows it, no sky protects it, no warmth repairs it. Yet it may hold, in its dark crust and enormous orbit, a record of the solar system before home became familiar. It does not know it is evidence. That is why it can be believed. The most dangerous maps are not the ones with blank spaces. They are the ones where the blank spaces have stopped looking blank. A blank space can be honest. It can say we have not looked deeply enough. It can admit that the evidence thins, the instruments strain, the models are provisional, and the region beyond the line remains unfinished in the human mind. That kind of blankness is not ignorance pretending to be knowledge. It is knowledge protecting itself from arrogance. The outer solar system has rarely been allowed that honesty. It has been drawn too cleanly. A row of planets, a belt of asteroids, 4 giants, a colder belt beyond Neptune, then darkness, then perhaps, much farther out, the Oort cloud, drawn as a soft shell around everything, because the mind prefers even its uncertainties to have shape. The diagram works because it simplifies brutally. It gives the eye something to carry. It turns a system too large for intuition into a sequence almost gentle enough for a classroom wall. But every useful simplification has an afterlife. First it teaches, then it settles. Then it begins to impersonate the thing it was only meant to describe. That is where the danger begins. Neptune becomes the last giant, so the mind makes it an edge. Pluto becomes the final planet, so the mind lets it punctuate the solar system. Then Pluto's neighbourhood fills with icy bodies, and the old punctuation mark becomes one object among many. The Kuiper Belt corrects the Pluto mistake, but correction has its own temptation. The new context hardens. The belt becomes the new shelf, the new outer province, the new place where the drawing feels allowed to fade. The mistake moves outward. It does not vanish. That is why the faint objects beyond the expected belt matter so deeply. They are not only additions to a catalogue, they are a rebuke to the emotional authority of the diagram. They say that even a corrected map can become too confident. Even a better boundary can inherit the old sin of sounding final. Even a scientific category, carefully earned, can begin to feel more complete than the evidence permits. The solar system did not expand when those objects were noticed. Our permission to admit its extent expanded. That distinction is humiliating in the right way. It reminds us that the universe does not wait for human categories before becoming itself. The bodies were already there, following their long curves, receiving weak sunlight, preserving old dynamical history, while our maps drew the region with more confidence than the dark had paid for. Nothing physical changed when the detections entered the conversation. The change happened inside the map. A line lost its innocence. This is not a failure of astronomy. It is astronomy doing the only thing that keeps it alive. A dead science defends clean pictures after the evidence has begun to bruise them. A living science allows the bruise to spread until the picture changes shape. It accepts uglier sentences when uglier sentences are truer. It lets the belt ends here become the known population appeared to decline under the limits of the surveys we had. That second sentence does not fit nicely on a poster. It fits reality better. There is a particular kind of maturity in learning to love that loss of elegance. Not because uncertainty is glamorous. Uncertainty is often tedious, technical, difficult to explain, and easy to abuse. But honest uncertainty keeps a map from becoming mythology. It marks where the ink is strong, and where it is only a guess pretending to be a coastline. The outer solar system needs ink that admits pressure. It needs a map that can show Neptune's gravity without making Neptune the whole author. A map that can show the classical Kuiper Belt without implying that classical means complete. A map that can hold a possible distant population, an apparent gap, a dust measurement, a temporary atmosphere, an unseen planet hypothesis, and the biases of the search itself, without flattening them into one dramatic answer. That map would be harder to remember. It would be more worthy of trust. Human beings dislike that trade more than we admit. We want knowledge to feel like possession. A named thing feels less frightening. A diagrammed thing feels less wild. A region with a boundary feels less capable of returning to embarrass us. But the solar system, especially at its edge, keeps teaching that possession is not the same as understanding. You can name a belt and still misunderstand its architecture. You can catalogue an object and still miss its atmosphere. You can draw a boundary and still be drawing the limit of your tools. This is the deeper mirror hidden behind the discovery. The subject is not only the Kuiper Belt, it is the human habit of mistaking representation for reality. We do it because we must. No mind can carry the raw scale of the solar system. Every diagram is a mercy. Every category is a handle. Every distance compressed onto a page is a small act of survival against incomprehension. But mercy becomes dangerous when it is forgotten as mercy. The clean map lets a child begin. It should not let an adult finish. A child needs Neptune to be a blue dot, Pluto to have a place, the Kuiper Belt to be a region, and the outer solar system to have some kind of implied edge. That first ladder matters. Without it, the mind falls through scale with nothing to hold. But a ladder is not the landscape. It is a tool for entering the landscape. At some point, the rung-marked edge must give way beneath the weight of better evidence. The new faint bodies put weight on that rung. It bends. The bend is valuable. It tells us the outer solar system is not a sequence of labels arranged for memory, but a history field. The planets are not beads. The belts are not tidy rings. The gaps are not necessarily empty. The distant bodies are not decorative leftovers. Everything has been shaped by formation, migration, resonance, collision, radiation, preservation, and observation. Observation belongs in that list. That is the part the old diagrams hide most completely. The map of the outer solar system is also a map of how the outer solar system became visible to us. Some regions look full because our instruments found their occupants first. Some regions look empty because the occupants are fewer, or because they are harder to detect, or because the surveys were not built to catch them well. Some patterns may belong to nature, some may belong to the net we used, some may be both. That mixture is not a flaw in the work. It is the work. A telescope dome turns under the cold. The camera records a field. The same stars appear again and again, almost unbearably still. One point shifts. The shift is measured, doubted, recovered. A possible orbit begins to form. No schoolroom diagram changes that night. No child wakes with a new solar system. But somewhere inside the machinery of knowledge, an old blank space loses the privilege of being treated as nothing. That is how maps become less arrogant. Not all at once. By small injuries. The injury reaches inward because this is not a distant galaxy. It is not some anonymous system around another star. It is ours. The same sun that warms skin on Earth also holds those distant bodies in their almost lightless orbits. The same formation history that eventually made oceans, air, forests, engines, telescopes, and human thought also left behind that cold debris. The unknown is not elsewhere. It is attached to home. That attachment is what makes the humiliation intimate. We can accept that the early universe remains mysterious. We can accept that galaxies beyond counting contain more than we will ever know. But the idea that the solar system itself still contains rooms where our certainty has outrun our evidence is different. It means home is not the completed object our diagrams imply. Home is still under revision. Not in the sentimental sense. In the technical sense. The boundaries are being recalculated. The populations are being tested. The categories are being stretched. The old apparent edge is being asked whether it was physical, observational, or both. The answer may take years. It may become messier before it becomes clearer. That is not a delay in understanding. It is the shape understanding takes when the subject is faint and far. The map must learn to breathe. A brittle map breaks when evidence changes. A breathing map expands. The better image of the solar system, then, is not a finished poster, but a living draft. Some lines are dark and well tested, others are pale. Some labels are stable, others are scaffolding. Neptune is not erased, Pluto is not diminished. The Kuiper Belt is not made false. Each remains real, but each loses the right to be simple. That is progress with teeth. The familiar objects become richer because their context deepens. Neptune becomes not merely a far blue planet, but a former sculptor whose old motion may still be written in smaller bodies. Pluto becomes not a lost ninth planet, but a bright witness to a wider cold population. The Kuiper Belt becomes not a final shelf, but a foreground. The darkness beyond becomes not a void, but a region where absence must be argued for instead of assumed. That last shift is the permanent one. Absence must be earned. In ordinary life, nothing seems easier than absence. An empty room, a silent field, a black sky. But in science, absence is often one of the hardest claims to make. To say something is not there, you must know where you looked, how deeply, under what conditions, for what signal, with what assumptions, and what kinds of things could have escaped you. The outer solar system forces that discipline, because it is built from objects designed by distance to evade casual certainty. A blank space is not an answer until the search has earned it. The old map did not earn every blank it printed. That is not condemnation. It is the natural history of knowledge. Every generation prints the best blank spaces it can. Later instruments test them. Some survive. Some fill with dots. Some become gaps with mechanisms. Some turn out to be artifacts of the search. The map improves not by becoming immune to correction, but by keeping enough humility to be corrected without shame. The darkness beyond the Kuiper Belt is now performing that correction. Quietly. Without drama. A few distant candidates, a spacecraft dust count, a possible atmosphere around a small icy body, a planet hypothesis that must remain under discipline, a set of models no longer allowed to lean lazily on a clean edge. None of these alone gives finality. Together, they change the moral posture of the map. They make certainty work harder. And perhaps that is the closest thing to wisdom a civilization can bring to the edge of its own star system. Not the belief that every darkness hides a marvel. Not the opposite belief that darkness means nothing. But the patience to say, we have not yet separated absence from invisibility here. That sentence is less beautiful than a boundary. It is more honest. Somewhere far out, a small body continues along a path too slow for a human life to respect. It does not know our diagrams. It does not care whether it belongs to a belt, an extension, a second population, or a category not yet named. It only keeps the orbit physics gave it. The meaning is ours to extract, and ours to ruin if we rush. The object remains. The map adjusts. The blank space stops pretending. And in that loss of false certainty, the solar system becomes less like something we own, and more like something we are still learning how to see. The solar system has more than one edge. That is the problem with trying to draw it. An edge sounds like a line. a place where one thing stops and another begins, a clean change of status. Inside, home. Outside, the galaxy. But the farther one follows the sun outward, the more that kind of border fails. The system does not end like a wall, it thins through different kinds of belonging. Near Earth, the sun rules by excess. Light is not scarce here. It spills. It warms stone, drives weather, feeds photosynthesis, raises storms from oceans, and fills the day so completely that human beings forget they live beside a star. The sun's authority is intimate. It enters the skin, it becomes food, it becomes climate, it becomes the ordinary confidence of morning. Beyond Neptune, that intimacy is gone. The sun still rules, but it rules differently. It holds with gravity what it can no longer comfort with warmth. It gives objects paths, not mercy. A body in the Kuiper Belt belongs to the sun, but its belonging is cold, mathematical, almost administrative. The star remains central, yet the body lives in a regime where sunlight has become too weak to feel like a world-making power. That is not the final edge. It is only the first betrayal of the childhood picture. Past the known Kuiper Belt, and past the possible further population now pressing against the old map, the solar system does not suddenly become interstellar space. It becomes stranger. Objects may be scattered onto long paths. Some may be detached from Neptune's easy influence. Far beyond them, in a region we infer more than see, lies the Oort cloud. Not a cloud in the visual sense, not a photographed shell, not a glowing border around the sun, but a vast suspected reservoir of icy bodies, so distant that most announce themselves only when they fall inward and begin to die beautifully. A comet is often an archive entering a furnace. For most of its existence, an Oort cloud body may remain in extreme cold, far beyond the regions where human maps feel stable. Then some disturbance changes the path. A passing star, the slow tide of the galaxy, a gravitational nudge too small to look dramatic at first. The body begins its inward fall. The sun grows from a distant gravitational owner into a physical threat. Ice warms, gas escapes, dust streams outward, a tail forms. From Earth, it can look like grace. A pale mark above the horizon. A visitor from the deep. But physically, the beauty is loss made visible. A comet's tail is not decoration. It is material being stripped away and illuminated during escape. The same light that reveals it is erasing part of what it carried. The inner solar system spends what the outer solar system stored. That exchange gives the far debris a different dignity. The Kuiper Belt is the nearest cold archive. The Oort cloud is the more remote one, less directly seen, more vulnerable to the galaxy's touch. Between them may lie a region less empty, less simple, and less well counted than the old diagrams suggested. The possible distant bodies beyond the known belt matter because they add texture to that passage outward. They make the road between the planetary neighbourhood and the inferred comet reservoir feel less like a blank corridor and more like a sequence of weakened claims. Heat weakens first. Then light. Then planetary control. Then, at the farthest reaches, even the sun's gravity must compete with the wider galaxy. This is why there is no single edge. The heliosphere, where the solar wind yields to interstellar space, is one boundary. It is a boundary of particles and pressure. Voyager crossed that threshold and taught us that the solar system is not just planets and debris, but also a bubble of solar influence moving through the interstellar medium. But the heliosphere is not the limit of the sun's gravity. Long after the solar wind has failed, distant comets may still belong dynamically to the sun. They are outside one kind of solar domain and inside another. They are beyond the wind, but not beyond the orbit. The same object can be outside the sun's breath and inside its memory. That is the kind of sentence a simple diagram cannot tolerate. It wants one border. Reality gives layered ownership. By heat, Earth is central. By reflected light, the Kuiper Belt is already difficult. By solar wind, The heliopause has its own threshold. By gravity, the sun's influence reaches far beyond where warmth became meaningless. By human detection, the edge sits wherever our instruments stop returning confident answers. That last edge is the least physical and the most treacherous. It moves whenever technology improves. It moves when a survey covers a wider field. It moves when software becomes better at separating slow motion from background stillness. It moves when a spacecraft measures dust where a model expected less. It moves when a star passing behind a small body reveals gas too thin to be called a sky. The detection edge pretends to be outer space. Often, it is only ourselves. Stand, in thought, on a distant icy body beyond the familiar belt. The sun is small enough to feel abstract, but bright enough to dominate the black. Neptune is invisible without instruments. Earth is not a blue marble. It is hidden near the glare, a warm point too close to the star to separate by ordinary sight. Every human archive, every cathedral, every language, every machine, every living forest is compressed into an inner brightness that the outer body does not need to acknowledge. From there, the inner solar system is not obviously the centre of meaning. It is the bright part. That reversal should disturb us more than distance alone. Meaning for us is concentrated near the fire. But history may be preserved far from it. The inner worlds are rich in transformation. The outer bodies are rich in retention. One region turns energy into weather, geology, metabolism and memory. The other keeps older materials in cold storage, not because it is noble, but because almost nothing has had enough power to remake it completely. The sun's farthest debris field is not a fence. It is a long gradient of forgetting and preservation. A body in that gradient may carry chemistry from the early disk. Another may carry an orbit shaped by Neptune's migration. Another may carry the imprint of a stellar encounter from the sun's lost birth cluster. Another may be a comet waiting for the galaxy to loosen it. Another may be a faint candidate beyond the Kuiper Belt, too newly found to interpret with confidence, but already strong enough to prevent the map from closing too soon. Each one is small beside the planets. Together, they keep the word edge from becoming honest. The Oort cloud sharpens this lesson because it is known indirectly. We do not see it as a structure. We infer it from long-period comets and dynamics, from the need for a reservoir large enough to supply bodies falling inward from remote directions. It is one of the great reminders that absence of image is not absence of knowledge, but also that knowledge without image must remain disciplined. The cloud is not a photographed kingdom. It is an inferred population at the border of solar belonging. That makes it an older cousin of the current Kuiper Belt problem. In both cases, the mind wants to turn an invisible or faint structure into a clean visual object, a belt, a cloud, a shell, a boundary. But the real structures are distributions, bodies on orbits, shaped by gravity, biased by detection, interpreted through models, revised by new data. Their names are handles. Their reality is messier. A handle helps you lift. It does not tell you the shape of what you are holding. This is where the possible objects beyond the Kuiper Belt become more than distant dots. They force us to rethink the middle distance between the known and the inferred. If the belt extends farther, or if a separated population exists, then the solar system's cold architecture has additional steps before the Oort cloud's vast uncertainty. The old picture jumped too quickly from known belt to remote reservoir, from mapped outskirts to almost mythic distance. The new evidence slows that jump. It puts ground under part of the dark. Not solid ground. Not certainty. But texture. And texture matters because it changes how the whole outward journey feels. Neptune is no longer a near-final marker. Pluto is no longer the symbolic threshold. The Kuiper Belt is not a last shelf. The region beyond is not a blank hallway. The Oort cloud is not a tidy outer shell waiting patiently at the end. The solar system becomes a chain of fading powers, each one giving way to another without a clean seam. The farther out we follow it, the less home resembles an object. It becomes a field of influence. A field can have no obvious wall and still have structure. A magnet's influence weakens without drawing a line on the table. A smell fades through a room without announcing where it ceases. A memory loses detail before it disappears. The sun's domain behaves more like that than like a kingdom with a border stone. Strong near the fire, weak in the far dark, still present after warmth has failed. This is the final enlargement before the ending. Not that the solar system is merely bigger than expected. Bigger is too crude. The better realization is that belonging itself changes form with distance. Near Earth, belonging is lived as climate. Beyond Neptune, as orbit. Near the heliopause, as pressure balance. Near the Oort cloud, as fragile gravity exposed to the galaxy. In our catalogues, as whatever faint evidence has survived the journey into detection. A distant icy object can belong to the sun while being almost untouched by sunlight. A comet can belong to the outer archive until the inner fire begins taking it apart. A spacecraft can leave the solar wind and still not leave the sun's deeper history. A map can show the solar system and still omit the conditions that make the showing possible. That is why the edge keeps moving. Not because nature keeps relocating it. Because we keep discovering which question we were really asking. Where does warmth end? Where does light fail? Where does the solar wind yield? Where does gravity lose to the galaxy? Where does detection become too weak to trust? Each question draws a different border. Each border is real only inside its own meaning. Confuse them, and the solar system becomes falsely simple. Separate them, and it becomes difficult enough to respect. Somewhere beyond the known belt, a faint body moves through one of these overlapping borders. It is not outside the solar system in any easy way. It is not inside it in the warm human sense. It occupies a colder category, held, barely lit, slowly counted, historically important, almost absent from ordinary imagination. The sun claims it without caring for it. That may be the most accurate description of the outer system. A claim without comfort. The telescope records another field. A dust detector registers another small impact. A comet, perhaps after ages of stillness, begins its fall toward visibility. The map does not receive one final line. It receives a series of corrections. The outer solar system remains open, not because it is vague, but because its boundaries depend on forces that fade at different rates. The edge is not one place. It is a set of failures. Warmth fails. Day fails. Wind fails. The old planet map fails. The belt name fails. The instrument fails, then improves, then fails farther out. And after each failure, something still remains attached to the sun, moving through darkness with enough obedience to belong and enough distance to make belonging feel almost impossible. The edge is only where one kind of seeing fails. That is the quiet correction hidden behind the Kuiper Belt. Not a wall. Not a final shelf. Not a clean place where the solar system stops being itself and becomes something else. Only a series of failures that human beings once compressed into a border. Warmth fails first, then daylight in the human sense, then quick motion, then easy detection, then the confidence of a diagram. Farther out, even the sun's influence changes character, until home no longer feels like a room around a fire, but a long, weakening claim stretched through darkness. The discovery of distant objects beyond the familiar belt does not give that darkness a simple answer. It gives it texture. That is more important. A simple answer would have ended the story too soon. A hidden planet, a second belt, a clean extension, a single cause behind the faint bodies, the possible gap, the dust, the strange orbits, the thin atmosphere around a small, frozen object. Any one of those, forced too early, would give the mind relief. It would let the old map be replaced by a newer map with the same old mistake inside it. A sharper border. A fresher certainty. Another place to stop thinking. But the outer solar system has not offered that comfort. It has offered a worse and better thing. Evidence strong enough to disturb the old picture, not yet complete enough to harden into a new one. Faint bodies where the known population was expected to decline. Dust measurements that make the emptiness less passive. Small worlds whose physical behaviour may be stranger than their size permits at first glance. Orbits that ask whether Neptune, the early disk, lost stellar neighbours, survey bias, or some unseen mass wrote the pattern we are beginning to read. None of these clues stands alone as a verdict. Together, they change the posture of the map. That is the real ending. Not certainty. Posture. The Kuiper Belt is no longer the comfortable final shelf beyond Neptune. It is a visible foreground. Pluto is no longer the lonely last world of the old childhood sequence, nor only the demoted planet of public memory. It is one bright member of a broader cold province that still has poorly counted outskirts. Neptune is no longer simply the final blue giant before the darkness. It is a former sculptor, a migrating force whose old gravity may still be readable in the small bodies beyond it. The darkness beyond them is no longer an afterthought. It is a test. A test of instruments, a test of models, a test of whether absence has been earned, a test of whether human beings can let home remain unfinished without filling the unfinished part with whatever story is easiest to love. That is harder than it sounds. The mind wants a final image. It wants the solar system to be a thing it can hold. Sun, planets, belts, cloud, edge. The outer dark refuses that grip. It says the system is not a row of objects, but a history of forces. Some forces built planets. Some displaced debris. Some preserved small bodies in cold. Some erased evidence closer to the sun. Some became visible only through a faint point shifting against a background star. The map was never just a map of matter. It was also a map of what our evidence could survive. That is why the newly detected objects matter, even if they never become famous. Most people will never know their designations. No one will print them on bedroom posters. No spacecraft may ever pass close enough to turn them into landscapes. They may remain numbers, orbital arcs, brightness estimates, uncertain sizes, faint marks in a survey table. But a witness does not need fame. It needs position. A small icy body at the far side of the old assumption can change what the assumption was allowed to mean. If it belongs to a farther population, the archive extends. If it sits across a gap, the gap demands cause. If its orbit resists easy explanation, the early solar system becomes less tidy. If more bodies like it appear, the old edge was not merely incomplete. It was premature. That word is gentler than wrong and more damaging than mistaken. Premature means the conclusion arrived before the evidence had finished speaking. The outer solar system has always punished premature endings. Pluto punished one. The Kuiper Belt itself punished another. Now the region beyond the belt may be doing the same thing again, not by overthrowing everything known, but by making the known picture less capable of pretending it is final. This is how knowledge should age. Not by staying smooth. By acquiring scars where reality pressed through. A telescope on a mountain gathers another field. The stars hold their old positions. One point does not. A spacecraft far from the warmth that launched it registers a small impact, or sends a measurement through a silence so wide that response has to travel as patience. A background star dims at the edge of a small icy body, and the shape of that dimming suggests gas so thin that no lung would call it air. Nothing in these moments looks grand from the outside. The grandeur is in the constraint. The universe, has not shouted. It has made the old sentence harder to say. That may be the cleanest form of revelation available at the edge of home. Not an announcement, but a restriction placed on ignorance. We can no longer say the outer Kuiper Belt fades into emptiness with the same ease. We can no longer treat the word belt as if it contains the whole architecture. We can no longer assume that small, cold bodies are physically simple because distance has made them visually poor. We can no longer confuse a weak return of light with a strong conclusion about matter. The blank has lost its innocence. And once that happens, the solar system changes inward. Earth becomes stranger. Not because it is smaller. That is the shallow lesson, and it wears out quickly. Earth is not humbled merely by being tiny inside a large system. Earth is transformed by realizing that its normal conditions are local, delicate, and deeply unrepresentative. Here, sunlight is not a thin signal, it is weather. Here, a year fits inside memory. Here, air presses softly enough for speech. Here, water can stay open beneath a sky. Here, warmth edits matter so richly that stone, ocean, atmosphere, and life keep rewriting each other. The outer bodies show the other branch of the same origin. Not the branch that became alive. The branch that remained cold enough to keep older things. Earth spent its inheritance on transformation. The distant debris kept portions of the receipt. One made forests, cities, grief, music, engines, telescopes. The other kept dark ice, orbital memory, radiation skins, impact scars, volatile secrets, and paths shaped by forces older than any witness on Earth. Neither branch is separate. Both belong to the same beginning. That is why the distant objects beyond the Kuiper Belt are not peripheral in the deepest sense. They are peripheral only to comfort. To origin, they may be central. The warm inner rooms tell us what the solar system became when energy was abundant. The frozen outskirts tell us what could survive when energy was withheld. Between them lies the full violence and luck of a system that made life in one place and preserved evidence in another. A human being standing under sunlight is standing inside the edited version. A faint body beyond Neptune may carry some of the unedited lines. That thought should not be made mystical. The object is not sacred, it is not sending a message, it does not know it has been found. It has no intention, no memory as living things have memory, no purpose attached to its endurance. It follows law, it reflects almost nothing. It moves through its huge year without care for the warm planet that briefly noticed. That is exactly why it matters. Evidence is often most trustworthy when it has no reason to persuade. The object simply remains. We are the ones who must become careful enough to understand what remaining means. To remain beyond the belt may mean forming in a wider disk. It may mean being scattered and spared. It may mean carrying Neptune's old rhythm or escaping it. It may mean preserving the sun's vanished birth environment. It may mean exposing a survey bias we mistook for nature. It may mean belonging to a population that will look different once the next generation of searches deepens the census. The body itself does not choose among these meanings. The evidence will. Slowly. That slowness is part of the lesson. The outer solar system cannot be understood at the pace of attention trained by spectacle. Its bodies crawl, its signals weaken, its orbits exceed dynasties. Its best evidence arrives through accumulation, correction, and return. A point found once is not enough. A candidate needs recovery. An orbit needs time. A population needs statistics. A hypothesis needs exposure to future wounds. The edge teaches patience because impatience built the false edge. It teaches humility because confidence arrived where light had merely weakened. It teaches restraint because the most dramatic answer may not be the most necessary one. And it teaches something colder about home, that belonging does not always feel like warmth. The far bodies belong to the sun, but the sun does not comfort them. It holds them through gravity across distances where daylight becomes almost symbolic. They are inside the same system as Earth, yet they live in a condition so severe that Earth's normality begins to look less like the rule and more like a brief, protected exception. A warm exception near a star. Thinking about the Kuiper Belt this way changes the meaning of the title. Something hiding behind the Kuiper Belt is not only a physical population of distant objects, it is also a failure in the old imagination of edges. The hidden thing is architecture, bias, memory, cold history, the possibility that the solar system's outer record is layered, broken, and still unread, the possibility that the word home extends farther than the body can feel and less cleanly than the mind prefers. The title begins as a mystery of location. It ends as a mystery of perception. What does it mean to live inside a system and still not know its outskirts? What does it mean that the same sun that makes morning possible also holds dark bodies so remote that morning has no meaning there? What does it mean that our first diagrams of home were not wrong because they were childish, but because every first act of understanding must leave something out? It means the map was never finished. It means no honest map is. The final image should not be a new edge. That would betray the lesson. Better to leave the solar system without a wall. Leave it as a field of fading powers, heat becoming light, light becoming gravity, gravity becoming memory, memory becoming faint points moving through a detector after years of being nothing to us. Somewhere far beyond Neptune, one of those points continues its orbit. No wind follows it. No ocean marks its seasons. No atmosphere softens the black. The sun is a hard star in a sky without mercy. Its surface receives almost nothing, returns almost nothing, and keeps moving anyway, carrying a curve older than biology and quieter than myth. On Earth, a mirror gathers the small return. A dot shifts. A boundary weakens. The solar system does not become larger in that moment. It becomes less falsely small. And that may be the deepest kind of discovery. Not finding a new world bright enough to dominate the eye, but realizing that even the place we call home still has rooms where the light has not yet learned the walls.